What would it be like to be a fully mature, self-actualizing, fully functioning human being? This is the ideal, busy, happy person with all his faculties smoothly functioning in perfect cooperation. No wars going on inside, no hang-ups, no neuroses. The ideal productive person. The late Dr. Maslow made a study of self-actualized people, and they stack up this way. First, these superior people have the ability to see life clearly, to see it as it is rather than as they wish it to be. They are less emotional and more objective about their observations. They're far above average in their ability to judge people correctly and to see through the phony or the fake. Usually their choice of marriage partners is far better than average, although by no means perfect. These self-actualized people are more accurate in their prediction of future events. They see more fully, and their judgment extends to an understanding of art, music, politics, and philosophy. Yet they have a kind of humility, the ability to listen carefully to others, to admit they don't know everything, and that others can teach them. This concept can be described as a childlike simplicity and lack of arrogance. Children have this ability to hear without preconception or early judgment. As the child looks out upon the world with wide, uncritical, innocent eyes, simply noting or observing what is the case, without either arguing the matter or demanding that it be otherwise, so does the self-actualizing person look upon human nature in himself and in others. Without exception, Maslow found self-actualizing people to be dedicated to some work, task, duty, or vocation which they considered important. Because they were interested in this work, they worked hard, and yet the usual distinction between work and play became blurred. For them, work is exciting and pleasurable. Maslow found creativity to be a universal characteristic of all the self-actualizing people he studied. Creativeness was almost synonymous with the terms healthy, self-actualizing, and fully human. And here again, the creativity of these people is similar to that of little children before they learn to fear the ridicule of others. Maslow believes this to be a characteristic which is too frequently lost as we grow older. Self-actualizing people either do not lose this fresh, naive approach, or if they lose it, they recover it later in life. Spontaneity is typical of this person. Self-actualizing people are less inhibited, therefore more expressive, natural, and simple, and of course, they have courage. The courage that's needed in the lonely moments of creation. This is a kind of daring, going out in front all alone, a defiance, a challenge. Thus, while these persons are humble in that they're open to new ideas, they're willing to forego popularity to stand up for a new idea. The self-actualizing person is a hard worker. Inspirations are a dime a dozen. The difference between the inspiration and the finished product, for example, Tolstoy's War and Peace, is an awful lot of hard work. To go on, the self-actualizing person has a low degree of self-conflict. He's not at war with himself. His personality is integrated. This gives him more energy for productive purposes. As Maslow puts it, truth, goodness, and beauty are in the average person in our culture only fairly well correlated with each other, and in the neurotic person even less so. It is only in the evolved and mature human being, in the self-actualizing, fully functioning person, that they're so highly correlated that for all practical purposes they may be said to fuse into a unity. The psychologically healthy person is both selfish and unselfish, and in fact these two attitudes merge into one. The healthy person finds happiness in helping others. Thus for him, unselfishness is selfish. They get selfish pleasure from the pleasures of other people, which is a way of being unselfish. Or saying it another way, the healthy person is selfish in a healthy way, a way which is beneficial to him and to society too. Research indicates that the healthy person is most integrated when facing a great creative challenge, some worthwhile goal, or a time of serious threat or emergency. The mature person has a healthy respect for himself, a respect based upon knowledge that he is competent and adequate, and, while not dependent upon it, frequently receives deserved respect from others. Such a person does not need or value unwanted fame or notoriety. He's in control of himself and his destiny. He's not afraid of himself, ashamed of himself, or discouraged by his mistakes. He makes mistakes, but takes them in stride. The psychologically healthy person is highly independent, yet enjoys people. He's free. He resists the dictates of culture when it does not agree with his point of view. The average person is motivated by deficiencies. He seeks to fulfill his basic needs for safety, belongingness, love, respect, and self-esteem. The healthy person is motivated by a desire for self-actualization or growth. A man has a hierarchy of needs. As one is satisfied, a new one pops up. The needs start with the purely physiological: food, liquid, shelter, sex, sleep, and oxygen, not necessarily in that order. For the man who's extremely and dangerously hungry, Dr. Maslow said, no other interests exist but food. He dreams food, he remembers food, he thinks about food, he emotes only about food, he perceives only food, and he wants only food. But what happens to man's desires when there's plenty of bread, and when his belly is full? At once other and higher needs emerge, and these, rather than physiological hungers, dominate the organism. And when these in turn are satisfied, again new and still higher needs emerge, and so on. Maslow contends that throughout his life the human being is practically always desiring something. He is a wanting animal, and rarely reaches a state of complete satisfaction except for very short periods of time. As one desire is satisfied, another pops up to take its place. Once the physiological needs are fairly well satisfied, safety needs arise. Now, since the safety needs are generally fairly well satisfied in the healthy, normal adult, they can be best understood by observing children or neurotic adults. Child psychologists and teachers have found that children need a predictable world. A child prefers consistency, fairness, and a certain amount of routine. When these elements are absent, he becomes anxious and insecure. Freedom within limits, rather than total permissiveness, is preferred. In fact, is necessary to develop well-adjusted children, according to Dr. Maslow. Insecure or neurotic adults behave much like insecure children. Such a person, says Maslow, behaves as if a great catastrophe were always almost impending. He's usually responding as if to an emergency. That is to say, a neurotic adult may be said to behave as if he were actually afraid of a spanking. The insecure person has a compulsive need for order and stability and goes to great lengths to avoid the strange and the unexpected. The healthy person also seeks order and stability, but it is not the life or death necessity that it is for the neurotic. The mature person also has an interest in the new and the mysterious. When the physiological and safety needs are met, needs for love, affection, and belongingness emerge. The person now strives for a place in his group, and he'll strive with great intensity to achieve this goal. It suddenly becomes more important than anything else in the world, and the person may even forget that once when he was hungry, he sneered at love as unreal or unnecessary or unimportant. Love in the sense of being deeply understood and deeply accepted, Carl Rogers' definition. Following this is the need for personal development and the utilization of one's potential. On and on the needs of humankind go, the need for identification, the need to understand the unknown, the need to transcend whatever has been accomplished in the past. They're never-ending. In trying to understand what motivates people, it's important to remember that once a need has been gratified, it has little effect on motivation, at least for a while. As Dr. Maslow has said, a want that is satisfied is no longer a want. As long as we want things and are motivated toward their achievement, we are alive, interested, motivated. If we run out of wants or lose all hope, an unhealthy situation develops. Dr. Maslow talks of clinical experience with cases in which previously healthy adults suffered boredom, loss of interest in life, depression, and self-dislike. Such symptoms, when they appear in apparently intelligent people, are often brought about when, in Maslow's words, people are leading stupid lives in stupid jobs. I've seen many women, Maslow goes on, intelligent, prosperous, and unoccupied, slowly develop these symptoms of intellectual inanimation. Those who followed the recommendation to immerse themselves in something worthy of them showed improvement or cure often enough to impress me with the reality of the cognitive needs. One of the major problems of the growing adult, the adult who aspires toward fulfillment and self-actualization, is the choosing of new meaningful goals as his former goals are accomplished, and, being accomplished, no longer motivate him. It's important that we do not stop along the line and sit down for too long. To remain healthy and alive, a person needs a new interest, a new challenge as he satisfies the old ones. If a person aspires to a certain level in the business world, a certain income, and reaches it, and if it's quite adequate for his needs, it won't motivate him for very long. Something new must be introduced. If the man doesn't find it, then management should, if the man is to continue to grow and make a major contribution to the organization and to himself. Motivating people is as important for the people as it is for the vitality of the organization, whether the organization is a family unit, a school class, a research organization, or a business concern. Some people are self-motivating. We all know such people. They're always off on some interesting new endeavor, but I'm afraid a large percentage are not. They seem to lack the curiosity or the creativeness or the knowledge to seek out new motivating challenges for themselves. Our lives are full of things, our pasts full of events that were once the most exciting things that buoyed us up to great heights of expectation and filled our lives with fresh new interests. Today, well, their old hat, like the 3-year-old car or the 10-year-old home, they no longer suffice to motivate us. And what's the busy wife and mother to do when the last of her kids marries and moves away, or when her husband retires from his job of 30 or 40 years? We must consciously see to it that we do not run out of wants, that we can still sit down and make out a want list and find ourselves getting that old excitement again for something new to plan and work for. The human being needs desperately that carrot on the stick. Dr. Maslow said to his students, if you deliberately plan to be less than you are capable of being, then I warn you that you'll be unhappy for the rest of your lives. You'll be evading your own capacities, your own possibilities. Henry James, the very prolific American novelist, brother of William James, who is often called the father of American psychology. In fact, the James family remained outstanding for generations. Henry James once wrote in The Ambassadors, live all you can. It's a mistake not to. It doesn't so much matter what you do in particular, so long as you've had your life. If you haven't had that, what have you had? What one loses, make no mistake about that. The right time is any time that one is still so lucky as to have. Live. Well, that wouldn't be a bad piece of advice to have framed and placed in a conspicuous place, would it? Live all you can. It's a mistake not to. But it seems that relatively few people are aware of living, as they take so many important things for granted. They wake up, go about their days, go back to sleep without once having thought, I am alive, and I'm sensing this day. It is only when life begins to reach its conclusion that people become aware of the importance of living. It's like those people who have to be sick to appreciate good health, or deprived of their freedom in order to realize its value. People who are aware of living, of enjoying living, are like sponges. They soak up all that goes on around them. They're aware of other people, of what's being said. They're observers of their environment. Their eyes are everywhere. I played golf once with a man who often stood with his eyes squinted, staring for long moments at the trees or a particularly pleasant view. I asked him about it. He said, now look at that grove of trees over there and squint your eyes. Look at the rich black shadows underneath them. And then he said, black is the mother of all color. It was a curious thing. And so I stood and squinted my eyes, and sure enough, the sight appeared as a painting, and the shadows did deepen. Everyone else on the golf course was simply playing golf. This man was acutely aware of everything going about him as well. He was living more than we were. He was getting more out of his life than we were. As Henry James said, the right time is any time that one is still so lucky as to have. The right time is while we're working, or driving, or with our loved ones, or alone. The right time is the only time we've got, which is now. And if we haven't learned to live now, we'll always be living on the hope that perhaps the future will be somehow better. Now is the future we were thinking about last year, and if you don't make it into tomorrow, will you have enjoyed? Will you have been aware of today? Well, it's worth thinking about. Anything that can make life more interesting, more vivid, is worth giving some thought to. Older people are always saying to younger people, you don't realize how lucky you are, which I suppose means that they didn't either. Robert Jones Burdett wrote, there are 2 days in the week about which and upon which I never worry. 2 carefree days, kept sacredly free from fear and apprehension. One of these days is yesterday, and the other day I do not worry about is tomorrow. It isn't the experience of today that drives men mad. It's the remorse for something that happened yesterday and the dread of what tomorrow may disclose. That's good, isn't it? It reminded me of a line in Matthew in the New English Bible in which Jesus is quoted as saying, so do not be anxious about tomorrow. Tomorrow will look after itself. Each day has troubles enough of its own. If a person could take Robert Burdett's advice to heart, if he could keep those 2 important days free from fear and apprehension, if he could never be remorseful about yesterday or concerned about tomorrow, it would do a lot more than lift a great load from his mind. It would cause him to concentrate on the only time we have, which is right now. If we handle today properly, we need take no thought about tomorrow. When tomorrow comes, we can handle it as best as we can, and it'll take care of the day after. This is not to say that we should not set goals for ourselves. I think we should, most definitely. But once we know what our goals are, we can quit worrying and set ourselves to today's task in the calm assurance and expectation that we'll reach the goals we've set in good time. Living is like building a house with bricks. You can set only 1 brick at a time. You can live only 1 day at a time. We all know this. Understanding it is not difficult, but doing it is something else again. We need, I think, some kind of reminder every morning, perhaps at many times during the day, until we can form the habit of living in which someone called daytime compartments. This is a panic-proof way to live, because we can almost always handle the events of today. It's the imagined disasters of tomorrow or next week or next year that tend to wear people down and make negative misfits of them. Moreover, by living today and doing the best we can with today, we won't have remorse tomorrow. We'll tend to be satisfied with what we're doing, even as we strive to improve. Each of us has 1,000 times approached a period of his life with fear and apprehension, only to find the problem solved one way or another on the appointed day. Perhaps we were not always happy with the solution, but the problem was met, resolved, and we moved on by it. If we had not worried about it, we would have spared ourselves many unnecessary hours of fear and upset. We need only do the best we can to handle the problems of today, and in so doing prepare ourselves for the tomorrow we hope will make its appearance. Burdett's quote, "There are 2 days in the week about which and upon which I never worry. 2 carefree days, kept sacredly free from fear and apprehension. One of these days is yesterday, and the other is tomorrow." I was chatting with a West Coast psychologist and management consultant the other day. He's also an author of some note, and he happened to mention that he's conducted classes in prosperity. That is, he's tried to teach poor people how to become well-to-do and prosperous. How well he succeeded at that, I have no way of knowing, but I have little doubt that the subject can be taught. There are thousands of books on how I made $1 million in the stock market, or in raising chickens, or in real estate, or in mail order. It isn't so much the kind of business chosen or the line of work. It's possible to become prosperous in any line. It isn't what you do that's so important. It's more a matter, at least in the beginning, of our attitude. As the late Ernest Holmes once put it, prosperity just doesn't happen. It's at first a state of mind. Do you remember that famous comment of Mike Todd's? He said, "Being broke is a temporary situation. Being poor is a state of mind." Surveys have indicated that most people equate happiness with enough money to live well. Other surveys have proved that people who are well-to-do are generally happier than poor people. That makes sense. They have fewer worries. But you run into a great deal of skepticism when you tell poor people that prosperity depends more on the state of mind than on anything else. Few other objects are surrounded by as many myths, misinformation, and old wives' tales as is the subject of how to become prosperous. And my friend the psychologist told me that a series of questions can usually determine whether or not a person is going to make his mark financially. One is to ask the person how much money he intends to be worth by the time he's reached a certain age. This is followed by a question which asks, how much money do you wish you could be worth by the same age? If the two figures are the same, if the person being questioned intends to be worth the same amount he would wish to be worth, chances are he'll make it. He's serious about it, and he has the attitude that says, I will, not I hope I will. As Ernest Holmes put it, are you interested in making money and running your business successfully and getting a better salary? Of course you are. You want to be prosperous, and this is only right and sensible. The plain, practical, everyday problem of money-making is a definite part of living. The answer to it is summed up in these words. Prosperity awaits man's recognition and acceptance of it. Or it can be stated another way. Your financial success already exists, but it's waiting for you to see it and accept it as your own. Just decide on what is prosperity for you, and then head out, get busy, and it's usually a good idea to start where you are. There's possibly more opportunity lurking within your present environment than you can imagine. Once you create the proper mental attitude, the ideas you need will be attracted to you. They'll come right out of your own subconscious. Then, if your attitude is still right, you'll act upon your ideas. But it all starts with the right attitude. As scientists delve deeper into the nature of what causes things to be as they are, they find themselves immersed in an unseen world of infinite intelligence, acting in a lawful and purposeful manner. What we encounter in the physical world appears to be but a manifestation of invisible cause. The distinguished psychologist and incidentally the inventor of the famous lie detector, William Moulton Marston, wrote, "For years, as a psychologist, I've sought in the careers of great and everyday people the inner springs that make for successful living. There are two which seem to me of prime importance. The first is plain old hard work, governed by cool, logical thoughtfulness. The other is sudden, warm, impulsive action. Admitting that I can't name a single person of true accomplishment who hasn't forged success out of brains and hard work, I still hazard the sweeping assertion that most of the high spots and many of the lesser successes in their careers stem from impulses promptly turned into action. Most of us actually stifle enough good impulses during the course of a day to change the current of our lives. These inner flashes of impulse light up the mind for an instant, then, contented in their afterglow, we lapse back into routine, feeling vaguely that sometime we might do something about it, or that at least our intentions were good. In this we sin against the inner self, for impulses set up the lines of communication between the subconscious mind and daily action. Said William James, "Every time a resolve or fine glow of feeling evaporates without bearing fruit, it's worse than a chance lost. It works to hinder future emotions from taking the normal path of discharge. Thus we fail to build up the power to act in a firm and prompt and definite way upon the principal emergencies of life." Well, Dr. Marston wrote, "Once in Hollywood, where Walter B. Pitkin and I were retained by a motion picture studio, a young promoter presented an ambitious production idea to us. Well, the plan appealed to both of us. It was, I thought, distinctly worth considering. We could think it over, discuss it, and decide later what to do. But even while I was fumbling with the idea, Pitkin abruptly reached for the phone and began dictating a telegram to a Wall Street man he knew. It presented the idea in the enthusiasm of the moment. It carried conviction. To my amazement, a $10 million underwriting of the picture project came as a result of that telegram. Had we delayed to talk it over, we might have cautiously talked ourselves out of the whole idea. But Pitkin knew how to act on the spur of the moment. He had learned to trust his impulses. Behind many an imposing executive desk sits a man who is there because he learned the same lesson. The person who follows his impulses is not necessarily flighty, far from it. The timid soul, however, is fearful lest impulse lead him into all manner of mistakes. Mistakes are inevitable. We're bound to make them, no matter which course we take. Some of the worst mistakes in history have followed consciously reasoned decisions. The mistakes of inaction, flanked by heavy reasoning, are likely to be worse than the mistakes of genuine impulse. The life stories of successful people are full of episodes that have marked turning points in their careers. True impulses are intelligent. They reveal the basic interests of the unconscious mind. In the winter of 1969, Stanford University printed an article by Dr. Willis W. Harman, which I found to be of tremendous interest. Dr. Harman suggests that when future historians look back on our times, it will not be the wars, riots, student protests, or even our technological and scientific advances they'll remember. He suggests that it will be something quite different from any of these, an event perhaps well symbolized by an obscure scientific conference held in Council Grove, Kansas, in April of 1969. He further suggests that the consequences may be even more far-reaching than those which emerged from the Copernican, Darwinian, and Freudian revolutions. It has to do with transpersonal psychology, that field of inquiry which deals with man's subjective experience, especially the transcendental kind. Early writing in this field were F.W.H. Myers' Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, Richard Buck's Cosmic Consciousness, William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, and Patiram Sorokin's The Ways and Power of Love. This new age we're moving into, Dr. Shapley of Harvard calls it the psychozoic age, is based on several propositions, the most important of which is that the potentialities of the individual human being are far greater in extent and diversity than we ordinarily imagine them to be, and far greater than currently in vogue models of man would lead us to think possible. Another is that a far greater portion of significant human experience than we ordinarily feel or assume to be so is comprised of unconscious processes. Now, this includes not only the sort of repressed memories and messages familiar to us through psychotherapy, it includes also the wisdom of the body and those mysterious realms of experience we refer to with such words as intuition and creativity. Access to these unconscious processes is apparently facilitated by a wide variety of factors, including attention, free association, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, special drugs, and others. Now, included in these partly or largely unconscious processes are self-expectations, internalized expectations of others, images of the self and limitations of the self, and images of the future, which play a predominant role in limiting or enhancing actualization of one's capacities. These tend to be self-fulfilling. Much recent research has focused on the role of self-expectations and expectations of others in affecting performance, and on the improvement of performance level through enhancing self-image. The validity of the self-fulfilling prophecy and the self-realizing image appears to grow steadily in confirmation. That April 1969 Council Grove, Kansas conference on voluntary control of inner states, co-sponsored by the Menninger Foundation and the American Association for Humanistic Psychology, represented an unprecedented assemblage of scientists working with altered states of consciousness. Now, what we're seeing is the scientific stamp of approval and deepening interest in what the ancient prophets told us we could do. We're beginning to find a new image of man. We will begin the cultivation of an enhanced self-image in each individual child. Perhaps now at last men will begin to truly discover who he is and what his true powers are. Some time back, my old friend Dr. Herbert Otto wrote an article in the Saturday Review in which he pointed out how greatly we underestimate our true potentialities, and he explained why so many millions tend to withdraw from the world. It's because we are members of a pathology-oriented culture. Psychological and psychiatric jargon dealing with emotional dysfunction and mental illness has become the parlance of the man in the street. In addition, from early childhood in our educational system, we learn largely by our mistakes, by having them pointed out to us repeatedly. And all this results in early negative conditioning and influences our attitudes and perception of ourselves and other people. An attitudinal climate has become established which is continually fed and reinforced. As a part of this negative conditioning, there is the heavy emphasis by communications media on violence in television programs and motion pictures. The current American news format of radio, television, and newspapers, the widely prevalent idea of what constitutes news, results from a narrow, brutalizing concept 30 or 40 years behind the times, and is inimical to the development of human potential. The news media give much time and prominent space to violence and consistently underplay good news. This gives the consumer the impression that important things that happen are various types of destructive activities. Consistent and repeated emphasis on bad news not only creates anxiety and tension, but instills the belief that there's little except violence and disasters and accidents and mayhem abroad in the world. As a consequence, the consumer of such news gradually experiences a shift in his outlook about the world, leading to the formation of feelings of alienation and separation. The world is increasingly perceived as a threat, as the viewer becomes anxious that violence and mayhem may be perpetrated on him from somewhere out of the strange and unpredictable environment in which he lives. There slowly grows a conviction that it's safer to withdraw from such a world, to isolate himself from its struggles, and to let others make the decisions and become involved. As a result of the steady diet of violence in the media, an even more fundamental and insidious erosion in man's self-system takes place. The erosion affects what Dr. Otto calls the trust factor. If we've been given a certain amount of affection, love, and understanding in our formative years, we're able to place a certain amount of trust in our fellow man. Trust is one of the most important elements in today's society, although we tend to minimize its importance. We basically trust people. Now, the consistent emphasis in the news on criminal violence, burglarizing, and assault makes slow but pervasive inroads into our reservoir of trust. as we hear and read about the acts of violence and injury man perpetrates upon one another, year after year, with so little emphasis placed on the loving, caring, and humanitarian acts of man, we begin to trust our fellow man less, and we thereby diminish ourselves. By undermining our trust, we become estranged from each other. Existing in a setting that provides as consistent inputs multiple irritants, ugliness and violence, and lack of close, meaningful relationships, man is in danger of becoming increasingly irritated, ugly, and violent. Maybe you saw the news item some time back about a Canadian farmer who sold his Stradivarius violin for, I think it was in the neighborhood of $60,000. He sold it to the same New York City dealer he had bought it from many years before. The dealer paid him more for it than he'd paid. That's because the violin has appreciated in value over the years and because of the shrinking buying power of the dollar. But the farmer sold his precious violin by the world's most famous violin craftsman because, as he put it, "I'm getting old and I have no children to leave it to." By getting it back in the hands of the dealer, he knew that it would wind up in the hands of someone who would treasure it as he had, and he could use the cash. Antonio Stradivari, the Italian violin maker, lived from 1644 to 1737. That's 93 years at a time when the average life expectancy was around 30, and there's a story there. He worked alone, although later in his life his sons helped him. No committee advised him. No one made decisions for him. His tools were primitive, but that was not important. He put himself into his work. All the world's tools couldn't make up for that. When he was finished with an instrument, when he was sure that his work measured up to his own personal standards, he signed his name to it. And still today, more than 200 years later, his name is a household word all over the world. Ask anybody if he's ever heard of Stradivarius, which is the Latin pronunciation of the name. Throughout history, there have been many men with similar standards of excellence. Authors such as William Shakespeare, artists like Leonardo da Vinci, craftsmen like furniture maker Thomas Chippendale, and silversmith Paul Revere. Everything they did was done well, not because it had to be, but because they wanted it to be. They had only to please themselves, yet the products of their fertile minds and skillful hands are still collected and admired today. Now, what is it that causes one person to take pride in what he does, while others give little or no thought to the quality of their work? Do you know? Of course, when we were talking about Stradivari or Da Vinci, we were talking about great geniuses, towering talents who found their media and became great in them. There have been many other fine violin makers and artists who took just as much pride and care in their work but lacked the same quality of talent. There are even today many thousands of craftsmen who will not turn out shoddy work, who would be glad to sign their names to their work. But I think you'll admit that they're in the minority. Perhaps they've always been in the minority. But the respect for quality never changes. It still commands the highest price. It is still revered wherever we find it. And the person performing it has gained for himself two precious assets. One, he's built the kind of security that lasts a lifetime. He need never worry about his income. And two, his work is a source of satisfaction and joy to him. He derives deep satisfaction from being an uncommon person. There are people who set their own high standards to which they make themselves measure up. They're quite happy to put their names on their work, and their work will stand the test of time. A DePaul University psychologist, Dr. Irma Halfter, has proved beyond any question of a doubt, through years of carefully documented studies, that our ability to learn improves with age. In other words, the old saying, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks," may pertain to dogs, but does not apply to human beings. Someone once used that saying to Dr. Robert Hutchins, I believe it was, and he replied, "People are not dogs, and knowledge is not a bag of tricks." Dr. Halfter has given new hope and renewed ambition to older people who thought the world had passed them by and that they can never compete mentally with the young. So significant are her findings that more than 600 schools, colleges, universities, government departments, and other interested organizations have asked for copies of her studies, which began when she was a candidate for her doctorate at the University of Chicago. According to Frank Hughes, who dug up the story, she has proved that older adults do about 10% better in the same circumstances, the same classrooms, than their younger companions. Now, her study of learning ability covered virtually every field of human activity: business, communications, education, humanities, modern languages, natural sciences, mathematics, nursing, professional art, professional music, and social studies. She experimented with groups of older women, but she's proved the same story with men. Sex makes no difference in learning ability. As the doctor reported on her tests with women, older women gave a superior total performance and a superior performance in each of the fields of study. In particular, the older women earned more A's than the younger women and had approximately equal percentages of B's and C's and a lesser percentage of D's and F's. One of Dr. Halfter's pet peeves is this business of college for everybody. She says, one of my pet gripes at industry is that they don't need college graduates. They have so routinized industry that the college degree is really foolishness. I think all of society is on the wrong kick on this. College is a way to keep young people out of the labor force, but industry has so routinized jobs that decision-making is gone. So what do you think of that? Her important contribution is that our ability to learn is not impaired with the advance of the years. On the contrary, it gets better. People going back for their college degrees in their 60s find little difficulty in keeping up with their younger classmates. So it isn't your chronological age that matters in the learning process, it's your functional age. And if you're functioning normally, you can learn anything you want to, and on the average, you'll do better than you would have done in your late teens and early 20s. Now, I think this is good to know. I'm sure the very young are as glad to learn about this as are their parents and grandparents. So if you hear anyone saying, I'm too old to take that up now, you straighten him out. Remember Dr. Hutchins' comeback. The next time you hear someone say you can't teach old dogs new tricks, tell him that people are not old dogs, nor knowledge a bag of tricks. I ran across a quotation that's just too good to pass up. It's by George Bernard Shaw from Back to Methuselah. Imagination is the beginning of creation. You imagine what you desire, you will what you imagine, and at last you create what you will. One of our major problems as persons is that we so often permit our imagination to be confined by our environment and conditions. One of the wonderful things about human imagination is that it can break out of the barriers that tend to limit us physically. It can fly away to greener hills. It can see things not as they are now, but as they can be. It can foretell the future, at least as far as we as persons are concerned, to an altogether unsuspected extent. It can draw the colorful mental images that we hope someday to turn into reality. Imagination is the beginning of creation. We imagine thousands of things, of course, but if we understand the power of imagination, we realize that that upon which our imagination becomes fixed tends to turn into reality. This is good and bad. Just as we can imagine wonderful things and conditions, we can also imagine unhappy, tragic situations. And whatever our imaginations become fixed upon will tend to become real in our lives. That's why control of the mind is so important. Control in the way we control a car. We want it to take us where we want to go. We don't want it to take us into a ditch or into another car. And so we're alert, and we control its speed and direction. It's the only way to drive successfully. Controlling the imagination, or freeing it along positive, growth-directed lines, will lead us in that direction. If we decide upon a goal we think is right and worthy of us, our imagination becomes like a pair of hands holding the picture in our minds, holding it and feeling every part of it, exploring it, turning it over, loving it. And as we hold that picture in the hands of our imagination, we're led toward it. The enormous power of our minds is set the task of achieving it, and the amazing answers begin to come to the surface of our minds. Soon, depending upon the difficulty and complexity of the image, it is ours. It's real. It exists in the world. It is an entity, where before it was only a picture in our imagination. Children have an overabundance of imagination, but it's rampant and uncontrolled, which is as it should be as children. As we grow older, we can put the power of our imagination to marvelous use. We can make of it a servant, a genie, to bring us anything we seriously decide upon, or its equivalent. George Bernard Shaw knew this when he wrote those lines. It's not a new formation. It's as old as philosophy itself. But few of us realize we can put it, this self-fulfilling prophecy, to use for good in our lives. Let me give you that quotation again. Imagination is the beginning of creation. You imagine what you desire, you will what you imagine, and at last you create what you will. My old friend Commander Edward Whitehead, chairman of the board of Schweppes USA Limited, made a talk some time back before the United States Naval Institute, which was so popular they printed it. And in this speech, he talked of the difficulty in finding the kind of men who can make it into top management. The title of his speech was How to Succeed by Really Trying, and in it he said trying, sustained effort, guts, resilience, the ability to spring back after defeat and discouragement, as well as some measure of ability, are the prerequisites of success. He said moral courage, a vigorous approach to problems, coupled with some degree of tact and preferably some personal charm, marks out the individual from the herd. As an employer, I can tell you that I'm immediately impressed by a young man who differs with me, who takes a different standpoint and does not hesitate to say so. Clearly, if he's going to survive, he must be right on at least some occasions. Also, his manner and approach must be respectful. But it never ceases to amaze me how few are willing to question, to challenge, still less reject the viewpoint pontificated by the boss. In the BBC broadcast Talk on Management Succession, his late boss, Sir Frederick Hooper, Commander Whitehead said, who is regarded as something of an expert in this field, referred to the difficulties of finding the right men to succeed in top management. He explained why he had learned to reject the specialist, the expert who developed such a penchant for his own particular field that he was seldom able to see a thing whole, to take the broad view. Even the all-rounder, the solid, reliable, capable administrator who ponders each and every problem and eventually comes up with an answer that is probably right, is not the man for top management, he said. The best candidate is likely to be the difficult, intractable fellow who gets under the skin of those above, below, and around him, the chap with insatiable curiosity, who challenges accepted notions, who will never accept anything, who always asks questions and wants to know if there might not be a better way. The Spanish adjective simpatico cannot be translated directly into English, but the man who can be so described, and who also possesses sensitivity and empathy, is certainly a jump ahead of the field. The capacity to get quickly on terms with the other person, to tune in on his wavelengths, to be able to judge his reactions to what you say is an invaluable attribute. If you have it, you know at once how far you can go, whether to suggest, persuade, flatter, cajole, or beat him over the head. This tells a young man full of steam and ideas how far he can go in forcing them upon a reluctant boss. The extent to which this quality is present is immediately conveyed to the man whose opinion you're trying to influence. If it's there, if he feels that you are simpatico, he will listen and be disposed to do what you want him to do. Some ideas on how to get to the top, or how to pick people for top management jobs. The best candidate is likely to be the difficult, intractable person who gets under the skin of those above, below, and around him, the person with insatiable curiosity, who wants to know if there might not be a better way. Many people, seeing Commander Whitehead in the well-known television commercials, do not realize that behind that famous beard and rich British accent is one of the finest minds in modern business management. His success in introducing his product to the world outside of England, Schweppes Tonic, is legendary. In his talks, he stresses the need for vigor, physical and mental. Feats of creative genius have been performed by ailing men, he said, men who were barely alive. But ordinary mortals cannot hope to emulate genius. For us, it's fair to assume that we can do a good day's work only when we're fit. The mind is a part of the body. It is all of a piece. And only if the body is in good shape does the mind continue to initiate things and function to maximum effect. Going further than that, prodigious efforts, great works, can only be done by a man with a superabundant energy and vigor. This comes sometimes as a gift from God, but if that is not the case, only hard work, years of discipline, years of training will produce the same effect. He goes on to say, personally, I can't even pretend to function efficiently if I'm feeling under the weather. I know, however, that when I'm in normal health, I function almost aggressively, laying about me in all directions at quite a pace. It's tough on my staff, but it gets things done. This vigor stems, I think, from being fitter than most of my contemporaries, and it's not happened by accident. I trained for the job. Moreover, I promised myself many years ago that, God willing, I'd live to reap the benefits of my labors. My experience, he goes on to say, indicates that considerations of this kind arise too frequently when it's too late, when a man has exhausted his reserves by years of abuse. Beyond a certain age, it is too late to repair the damage. I attach enormous importance, he said, to this attribute for reasons closely connected with that vital characteristic, resilience, the ability to spring back after defeat. A man needs vigor to stay the course. He must be bursting with it to enable him to ignore setbacks, disregard discouragement, and rise above inevitable deterrents to action. the sheer inertia or the indifference of others. Only a man of vision, which is an unquenchable spirit and immense vigor, will press on with his cause in the face of the apathy of those whom he is trying to persuade. Any person who has set out to achieve something that he considers to be worthwhile, whether it be a sacred cause or a personal ambition, will know exactly what I mean. Well, I could not agree with him more. Getting a good idea across to others, getting it implemented, getting it from the idea stage into concrete expression is one of the world's toughest jobs, and it takes a person in good physical condition to do it. As a general rule, people in top management positions are in surprisingly good condition. Dr. Gene Mayer, professor of nutrition, Harvard University, in a speech before the Charles Allen Thomas Science Symposium in St. Louis, pointed out the sad fact that the United States is constantly slipping with respect to the rest of the world for the average remaining lifetime for men at age 40. We've gone from 11th in 1966 to 40th and 9th to 23rd for women. And of all causes of death, cardiovascular death is the big problem. 1 million such deaths in each of the past 3 years, with 3/4 of these having been coronaries. That for almost half of our men in the 40 to 60-year range, death as a result of heart disease, means that we have returned unwittingly to the days of the great pandemics, like the great plagues of the 14th century, when 1/4 or 1/2 of the population died of one disease. And this American phenomenon is probably a preview of what will happen in all industrial societies eventually. Dr. Mayer went on to point out that among causes of cardiovascular death and crippling, obesity is the major factor, as it is with diabetes and liver disease. Obesity is a complex syndrome where genetic and environmental factors interact, and in some cases, traumatic factors are also involved. Our studies show that it can be due to disturbances in the function of regulatory mechanisms, of which the better known are situated in a part of the brain known as the hypothalamus. We're beginning to understand the mechanism of action of these centers well enough to imagine the possibility of a magic bullet depressing the action of the so-called feeding centers. Most obesity, however, appears to be directly the result of our mode of life. She said, "I have shown a number of years ago that the mechanism of regulation of food intake works poorly or not at all at very low levels of energy expenditure. As physical work decreases below a certain critical level, determined for each individual by heredity and clearly associated with body type, food intake stops decreasing correspondingly, or decreasing at all, and the individual becomes fat. Obesity is, for many, and probably for most of our overweight population, the result of a technology which, by emphasizing door-to-door individual transportation, labor-saving devices, and televised spectator sports, is affecting unfavorably the health and appearance of close to half of our adults. Lack of exercise does more than lead to obesity. Again, our research shows that hard and prolonged exercise protects against the hypercholesterolemic effects of a high diet in saturated fat, and to a certain extent against hypertension. In the presence of a significant narrowing of the arteries of the heart, it also leads to the opening of collateral vessels, and thus may avert a fatal coronary. It is thus not enough to mention technological approaches to preventing the number one killer and crippler of men in industrial societies. It's even more important to understand that the pandemic prevalence of cardiovascular disease is to a large extent the result of our uncontrolled technology. All of which means, if you want to live a full lifespan, take care of your heart by daily exercise and keep your weight down. So check with your doctor, watch your weight, and exercise every day. It isn't that we want to live forever, but why sacrifice 10 or 20 years of life just because of modern technology? A very interesting United Press International story appeared recently, Dateline New York. It seemed that many companies are faced with the problem of executives who resist taking vacations. According to Dr. Smith Montgomery of Personnel Psychology Center, New York City, and other business psychologists, the man who wants to skip his vacation nearly always is a risk of some kind to the company, and himself. Rarely is his excuse for staying on the job valid. According to Dr. Ralph Collins, consulting psychiatrist for Eastman Kodak Company of Rochester, New York, this executive likely will become dogmatic and irascible at the office, reducing morale and efficiency in his department. There are many executive types who want to skip vacations, virtually all bad, Montgomery said. One is the fellow who's afraid somebody else will be sitting at his desk permanently when he gets back. There's the man who's been covering his mistakes and fears the boss will find him out if he goes on leave. There's the spendthrift who can't afford a vacation. Often he covers up by pretending the company can't spare his services. He manages to have some large project on hand to look after during vacation season. There are those who really think they're indispensable, that the department couldn't get along without them for a few weeks. Another is the fellow who has a business of his own on the side which he can't leave. If he can't get away for a trip, he can't see any sense in taking leave from his regular job either. And finally, there's the occasional till-tapper. He's the one who has been doing some stealing and juggling the books and is afraid a surprise audit during his absence would mean prison. Employers are not entirely blameless for this vacation problem, said Montgomery. Business psychologists now and then encounter employers who intimidate employees into not taking vacations in order to save the cost of extra summertime help or to avoid losing the sales or services of a valuable employee. This is a good way to lose him permanently. I've known businessmen who refuse to take vacations on the theory that they just can't get away, but I've never known of a really valid case. By not taking his vacation, the boss deprives his family of their vacation fund and deprives the employees the pleasure of his absence for at least a short time during the year. As to being indispensable, that's so much papaya juice. Nobody is indispensable, as much as he might like to think he is. Quite often, much to the consternation of the boss, sales increase during his absence. Things actually run more smoothly, and overdue improvements can often be made. So take your vacation, get away from it all, and get a change of scenery, a fresh attitude, and quite often some excellent ideas you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. Yes, Virginia, there are those who resist taking vacations, and where you find them, you will also find problems of various kinds. There was once a manager who had all the tact and consideration for the feelings of others as a wounded wolverine. To him, there was only one way to do things, and that was his way. As far as he was concerned, all other human beings, but especially those in his charge, were revolving morons. The slightest mistake found him frothing at the mouth, cursing, shouting, running around like a crazy wind-up toy with hypertension. The turnover rate in his department was practically 100% per year. He belonged to the old school that's fond of saying, if you want something done right, do it yourself. That statement, incidentally, is the most blatantly conceited, stupid remark ever uttered by a creature famous for making stupid remarks. It assumes that no one else on earth can do a particular job as well as I can. That has to be false on the face of it. What the person who says that really means is, if you want something done the same old way, the way you like to see it done, then do it yourself. Anyway, this manager of whom I speak was a problem for the whole company and was fast becoming about as popular as a cute athlete's foot. Finally, it was suggested to him that he have a frank evaluation session with his people, with the idea of reaching better accord and bringing more peace and productivity into his department. The suggestion was made to him by a person of higher authority, so he went along with it. He got his people together and leveled with them. He wanted their opinions of him and their suggestions as to how their department could be more efficiently operated. Well, it was a revelation. The manager learned that he was not held in high esteem by his people, that they only tolerated his thoughtless and dictatorial methods because of the paycheck. But the most revealing and interesting question came from one of the youngest men in the department. He asked, "Where did you learn to manage others?" Well, this brought about a deep and prolonged silence, and it turned out that this manager had never studied management at all. He had never in his life read a single book on management techniques or how to get along well with other human beings. It seems that he had taken it for granted that management ability came along as standard equipment, like a navel at birth. He learned, in fact, that he didn't know the first thing about managing others, and that it might be a good idea if he gave a little thought to the subject, which he did. He began to study everything he could find on the subject. He built a fine library of materials on good management and became, in the process, a very good manager. The turnover in his department dropped to normal, people walked around smiling and whistling for a change, and productivity soared. The moral of the little story is that if you're a manager, have some frank, no-holds-barred evaluation sessions with your people. Tell them that what they say will have no effect on their jobs, and then listen. Getting along well with other people is still the world's most needed skill. With it, there's no limit to what a person can do. We need people. We need the cooperation of others. There's really very little that we can do alone. A really good novel is a rare and wonderful thing. We look forward to getting back to it, and we hate to put it down. Even though we rush through it, we hate to see it come to an end. You'll occasionally hear someone make the comment that he reads only non-fiction. In nonfiction, we seldom see the real truth, as far as people are concerned, except for those books about people written by experts. It is in fiction that the truth may be told. We can easily speak the deepest truth about ourselves when we're putting the words in the mouth of a so-called fictional character. Fictional characters can do or say anything, and we are safe and can say, well, it's only fiction. About the novel Henry James wrote, the advantage, the luxury, as well as the torment and responsibility of the novelist is that there's no limit to what he may attempt as an executant, no limit to his possible experiments, efforts, discoveries, successes. This is what makes writing a novel so exciting a thought to so many people. There's simply no limit as to what may be attempted. But, and this is the but that usually stands between the so-called novelist and his readers. Henry James also said, the only obligation to which in advance we may hold a novel without incurring the accusation of being arbitrary is that it be interesting. To be interesting, there's the rub, because to be interesting, you've got to be good. You have to write in such a way that the words themselves, the little black marks on the printed page, disappear, and only the thoughts and ideas and action in the drama, the smoothly flowing dialogue come through. The legend at the beginning of a good novel, the disclaimer about the characters being fictitious and any resemblance to persons living or dead being purely coincidental, is, of course, so much hogwash. The characters are not fictional. They're real. They are people we've met many times or read about in our daily newspaper. Novelists take their characters from real life, changing only the names and places to avoid suit for libel, not for misrepresentation, but for all too accurate a picture of the real person. To get an education, we've got to read a great deal of nonfiction. To be a successful writer, one needs reference books of various sorts, the more the better, all of which are nonfiction. Most of our reading is nonfiction, and that's fine. But if you've never tried good fiction, or have gotten out of the habit of reading good fiction, try it again. I had a letter the other day from a woman, a widow who lives in the South. She said she found much of her existence rather bleak. Good fiction will bring a whole new, exciting, colorful world into our lives. The person who loves books is never very lonely for long. The pages of his books are filled with interesting people who wait his pleasure, ready to entertain at a moment's notice. Yes, a really good novel is a rare and wonderful thing. I've finished 3 excellent novels in the past couple of weeks, and I always keep a couple in my briefcase when I travel. In Saul Bellow's excellent novel, Mr. Samler's Planet, published by Viking, he writes, underneath there persists, powerfully too, a thick sense of what is normal for human life. Duties are observed, attachments are preserved. There is work. People show up for jobs. It's extraordinary. They come on the bus to the factory. They open the shop. They sweep. They wrap. They wash. They fix. They tend. They count. They tend the computers. Each day, each night. And however rebellious at heart, however despairing, terrified, or worn bare, come to their tasks. Up and down in the elevator, sitting down to the desk, behind the wheel, tending machinery. For such a volatile and restless animal, such a high-strung, curious animal, an ape subject to so many diseases, to anguish, boredom, such discipline, such drill, such strength for regularity, such assumption of responsibility, such regard for order, even in disorder, is a great mystery, too. Oh, it is a mystery. One cannot mistake this for thorough madness, therefore. One thing, though, the disciplined hate the undisciplined to the point of murder. Thus the working class, disciplined, is a great reservoir of hatred. Thus the clerk behind the wicket finds it hard to forgive those who come and go in apparent freedom. And the bureaucrat, glad when disorderly men are killed. All of them. Killed. Well, that's one of the best pieces of writing I've come across in some time, and it's one of the reasons I like to read Saul Bellow. He makes you think. He makes you go back and read a paragraph over again. He pulls you up and puts all your mind to work. Surely we've all wondered why people stay in their traces instead of jumping out of them. People show up for jobs. It's extraordinary. They open the shop, they sweep, they wrap, they wash, they fix, they tend the computers, each day, each night. And however rebellious at heart, however despairing, terrified, or worn bare, come to their tasks, up and down in the elevator, sitting down to the desk, behind the wheel, tending machinery. Yes, it's a great mystery. Except that they do what they have been taught to do. They follow the examples of those who have gone before. Once in a great while, a bus driver will take off for Florida with his bus, or a newspaper man will sail alone across the Atlantic, but 99.99%, however rebellious at heart, however despairing, terrified, or worn bare, come to their tasks. How about you? Love your work? Love your life? Happy, like the old neighborhood, the town, the part of the country? Man has been called the responsible animal. As a rule, he sticks with his family, his friends, and his work, and tries to find meaning in it all. And it's a good thing he does. But reading Saul Bellow's words makes you think, doesn't it? And it is true that disciplined hate the undisciplined to the point of murder. Thus, the working class, disciplined, is a great reservoir of hatred. And the clerk behind the wicket finds it hard to forgive those who come and go in apparent freedom. In a great city, you see the teeming millions working in such order, commuting to and from work, tending their families and mowing their lawns and shoveling snow without question. It's marvelous. And it is a mystery, isn't it? Thank you. I was in San Francisco the other day, and an item in the San Francisco Chronicle caught my eye. It was about a woman who had earned a fortune designing and selling clothes for the children of the well-to-do. It said her secret was in the simplicity of the clothes she produced. The story carried a headline that read, "Children's Styles That Last Forever." The article, written by Joan Chatfield Taylor, began, "It's often true that the simplest things cost the most money, and nowhere is it truer than in children's clothes. If it's ruffles, bows, trendy colors, and faddy styles you want for your little darling, you can just stroll down to your five and dime mail-order catalog or discount store. If it's an absolutely plain dress or play suit you want, you may have to go to the 7th floor of I. Magnin to buy a Florence Eisman." Florence Eisman has been called the Norell of the children's wear industry. Like Norell, she specializes in rather simple shapes, perfectly executed in the best available fabrics. Also like Norell, she makes clothes that don't go out of date. The clothes she designed in the 50s could be worn by children today. Florence Eisman believes in utterly simple dresses, preferably without belts or waistlines, in clear, bright colors or classic neutrals like gray, navy, and black. The declining birth rate has been hard on the children's wear industry, but Florence Eisman continues to thrive. The high quality of the fabrics, most of which are imported from Europe, and the workmanship, all of which is done at the Eisman factories in Milwaukee and Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, are two reasons for the durability of Eisman designs. Well, in reading that story, I was struck by how much we can learn from it. It's a story that has to be told and learned over and over again. First, simplicity of design. Design following function. What is the product supposed to do? It's supposed to clothe small children who must not only look good in their clothes, but who spend a good deal of their time running, playing, squirming, climbing, sliding, staining, straining, and subjecting to every torture test possible the clothes they wear. Children don't change. They are much the same today as they were 10,000 years ago. Secondly, quality of materials and workmanship. Incidentally, I mentioned that I wanted to use the Florence Eisman story for a direct line to my wife, and she informed me that our little boy, Ted, wore nothing but Florence Eisman clothes when he was small, and that the clothes are still in service with various relatives. As I read the Florence Eisman story, it reminded me of a Sidney J. Harris column I had read and clipped the week before. Mr. Harris had predicted in a column written nearly 30 years before that the men's hat industry would very likely come to an end during his lifetime. After the column appeared, he'd received a stiff letter from the president of the Stetson Company taking issue with him and telling him he didn't know what he was talking or writing about. Well, last year, the Stetson Company went out of business. A few months later, HCA, the largest volume hat maker in the United States, announced that it intended to sell out. Sid Harris went on to point out that today about 1 man in 30 buys a hat, while at the turn of the century almost every man did. And he said, "I have long maintained that the so-called practical businessmen often don't know their own business, and that social theorists, poets, and even vagrants could sometimes tell them more about what's happening or going to happen than they learned from interviewing one another in the 537 club car back to the Ivory Suburb." In his column, written back in 1944, Sid Harris suggested that the American male was seeking a new masculine image, and that the traditional hat foisted on him since Victorian times made him feel foolish, pompous, and inept. I and all my friends under 30 at the time wouldn't be caught dead in a hat. But the hat makers blindly persisted in relying on classical styles when the whole mood and tempo of life had shifted into a higher gear. It was not lack of funds or facilities, as much as lack of imagination, that presaged the doom of the conventional American hat. Beginning after World War II, the American man resented the bland uniformity of the dumb-looking hat, which not only failed to make him look dashing and virile — in the past his father wanted only to look respectable — but also blew off in the slightest wind, failed to provide warmth and comfort, and became permanently misshapen in the first rainstorm. Florence Eisman waxed prosperous in the world's most competitive business, while the giants in the men's hat business, with all the wealth and facilities at their beck and call, failed. Florence Eisman makes simple, well-designed children's clothes that appeal to the good taste of discriminating adults and the functional needs of children, fashioned from the finest materials and sturdily fabricated to take such punishment for many years. The men's hat industry, on the other hand, it seems to me, did not ask, how can we design hats to fit the needs and desires of a changing market? Instead, they tried to sell a changing market an unchanging product. I think the American automakers missed the boat on the small, inexpensive-to-buy and operate car for the same reasons. The hat makers blindly persisted in relying on classical styles when the whole mood and tempo of life had shifted into a higher gear. I think that what Sidney Harris wrote about the hat business in 1944 is true of the world automotive market today, in which there's been a very obvious change going on for some time. I think many of the products turned out by the major automakers are as obsolete today as the Victorian hat, and I think the first one that applies the common-sense, good-taste system of Florence Eisman will capture an inordinate share of not just the American market, but the world auto market as well. Now, how about what we do? How can we apply the Florence Eisman formula to what we produce? It isn't her formula at all, really, as I'm sure she'd be the first to admit. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece. She and the few others like her have simply had the good judgment and good taste to apply the formula and reap the inevitable rewards. It will perhaps pay us to take a new look at what we do and ask some important questions, such as, 1, what is my product or service supposed to do? What is its real function? 2, is it doing that in the best and most direct way possible? 3, is it simple, uncluttered, in good taste, and of the best materials available to me? 4, does it meet the needs of my customers and prospects, and will it continue to meet their needs for many years to come? 5, is it the very best we can produce to do the job it is intended to do? 6, do we have our customers' best interest in first place, or have we made them subordinate to profits? The test of a good or great product is that it tends to remain in style for many years, even centuries. The architecture, statuary, and literature of ancient Greece is still right up to date, as interesting and as valuable today as it was 2,000 years ago. A Stradivarius violin or a painting by one of the masters, good crystal, silver, and china, all have appreciated over the years, like good real estate. Now, how about what we do? Will it meet the test of greatness, or be so much useless junk in a few short years? I know a man and his wife who migrated from a small town in Oklahoma to the big city of Los Angeles. When his friends asked them what they were going to do out there, they told him that they were going to stay in the same business, which was operating a medium-sized eating place. Nothing fancy, just hamburgers, fried chicken, and shrimp, soft drinks, and coffee. Well, as friends do, they shook their heads and did their best to dissuade them. They told my friends that there were almost as many eating places in Los Angeles as there are people. One report even says that there's more. Why, on just one boulevard, you know, the one that's hard to pronounce, there are 1,000 eating places lined up on both sides of the street so close together they breathe on each other with their exhaust fans. But undaunted, the couple moved to the great sprawling city with its teeming millions of people and ubiquitous eating places. In an undistinguished part of town, on an undistinguished thoroughfare, they rented a very small, vacant store. They equipped it with the necessities for such a place, with only 4 or 5 rough tables and benches, put a small identifying sign out front, and opened for business. Within 60 days, they were operating a gold mine. They had planned to be open 7 days a week until they found which day was the lightest, and then they'd close on that day. There were no light days. Every day was busy, and the little cash register rang from morning to night. They were so busy cooking hamburgers they didn't have time to clean off the tables, so the customers did it for them, putting the paper cups and plates and napkins into the trash can for them. They then hired a boy to keep the place clean and generally help around the place. Every night, they'd go home exhausted but happy. Their business is a big success. Right across the street from them, a large, nationally syndicated and advertised drive-in has been in operation for several years. Soon the manager of that place was sneaking into my friend's place to eat his lunch, and his employees dropped in after their shifts. Working people from as far as 10 miles away drive to my friend's place for hamburgers. A couple from a little town in Oklahoma have become a hit in the big city with the thousands of eating places. How did they do it? Charge less for their hamburgers? No, theirs actually cost more than the average. But instead of competing with all the other eating places in the city, my friends created. Instead of buying the uniform little hamburger patties from the wholesaler, as most everybody else does, so that every hamburger tastes exactly alike no matter where you go, my friends buy their hamburger from a local supermarket and make their own, 4 to the pound. Each hamburger has a 1/4 of a pound of meat, is served on a 5-inch toasted bun with crisp, fresh lettuce, garden-grown tomatoes, and thick, juicy slices of onion. Their secret? It's simple. They just serve the best hamburgers anybody ever ate. They'll never sell as many as the big place across the street, maybe, but they sell all they can cook, and the little cash register rings all day long. Will Durant, the famous philosopher, has written that human beings can be divided into 2 main categories, negative and positive. Now, we all know there are people who have more positive impulses than negative impulses. With these positive people, the tendency is to approach, to seek, to overcome, and to possess. These are the positive characteristics. And there are others in whom the negative impulses predominate, people in whom the tendency generally is to hesitate, to retreat, to find shelter and safety, to submit. And it's these people the philosophers call the negative characters. Now, no person is entirely all of one or the other. Each of us has some of both, but we lean heavily toward one or the other. Dr. Will Durant says the negative character tends to be undersized, and though he admires very much every redeeming quality of his face, his form, his mind, he's always awkwardly conscious of his physical inferiority and looks enviously out of the corner of his eye at the tall and vigorous workman or the man of affairs who passes by erect in the pride of stature and health. What the negative person lacks above all is body, energy, horsepower, according to Durant. He seems not to have enough blood. At the table, he has no appetite. He's finicky with food and easily disgusted. He worries about whether he left a big enough tip. He walks from the room as if he hoped no one would see him and feels as though everyone is looking at him. If insult or danger comes, he trembles with surprise and fear. He does not feel active anger, but is consumed with a fretful resentment. His violence is the mask of one who knows that he will submit. He shrinks from responsibility and trial and longs for the quiet security and retreat of his home. He admires the cowboy and the Superman. He believes that the world would trust him with leadership if it had intelligence. If he succeeds in anything, he credits himself. If he fails, he's not guilty according to him. He blames the environment or the stars. He never blames himself for failure, but gets bitter toward the world instead. Nevertheless, he may be great by the very force of that unrestrained imagination that always seems to go along with negative characters. At his height, he may become a poetic genius. At his lowest, he is an intellectual, not a thinker. He never walks if he can ride. He never stands when he can sit, and he never stays awake when he can sleep. Because of this, he cannot sleep well. He hasn't been awake enough to bring on restful sleep. His nerves are tired, but his flesh is not. He's always on edge. He is social in his hunger for popular approval. He conforms timidly to the conventions. Withal, he is kindly and affectionate, grateful, loyal, and reverent. There is no cruelty in him, and little coarseness. He is restless, though always seeking rest. He passes discontent from project to project and from place to place. He is a ship that never makes a port, while its cargo rots. He is given to bursts of passion that simulate strength, but they end in quick exhaustion and accepted chaos. He has 1,000 wishes, but no will. Will Durant's bleak description of the negative character. Now, here's his description of the positive character. The positive person has health and vigor, a sufficiency of flesh and blood to warrant him looking straight into the eyes of the world and wearing his hat as he likes. If he looks at you, it's face to face. But he does not look at you. He is absorbed in his enterprise, intent on his goal. He is less interested in persons than in purposes. All the impulses of approach are strong in him. He eats with gusto. He has a passion for acquisition and possession. His motto is to have and to hold. And because he's more self-assertive and successful than a negative man, he makes every modern nation into a replica of himself, rapaciously acquisitive. Or maybe he has an extravagant wife. In olden days, he would have been a feudal baron or a soldier, but today he's an executive, and just as positive as when he brandished a javelin. In him, desires are not timid aspirations. They're unavoidable impulsions. For their sake, he will accept responsibilities, dangers, and wearing toil. He has more courage than virtue and less conscience than pride. He has powerful ambitions. He despises limits and suspects humility. If he meets a man stronger or firmer than himself, his impulse is not to bow down before him, but to honor him with emulation and rivalry. If he is defeated, it is after a struggle to exhaustion. He is curious. All processes lure him, and his mind plays actively about strange and novel things. He believes in action rather than in thought, and like Caesar, he thinks nothing finished if anything remains undone. He likes a tumultuous life and is not tempted by rural simplicity and peace. Peace, he thinks, was made for old age and does not become a man. He is domineering and likes to feel that men are bricks to his trowel, to build with them what he likes, and they find a secret zest in being led by him. He's so certain, so confident, and so cheerful. His activity makes him healthy and leaves him no time for thought or gloom. He enjoys life, bad as it might be, and does not ponder much on the future or the past. Nevertheless, he's a man of ideas, not a poet, nor a painter, nor a theoretical philosopher, nor a scientist, but an inventor, an architect capable of original designs, an engineer brave enough to span great rivers with poems of woven steel, a sculptor commanding marble into life, a scientist willing to face all the world in defense of a new truth. When his wife irritates him, he goes to his club. When the club bores him, he forgets himself and his work. His active life defends him against nerves. What he has above all is will. Not wills, but will. Not a medley of ambitions and desires canceling one another in unreconciled hostility, but a unity of aim, an order and perspective of purpose. He dies never doubting that life was a boon, and only sorry that he must leave that game to younger players. Each of us has some of the positive and some of the negative in our makeup. The idea is try to make the best use of the good qualities of both. Here's some information about an unlooked-for but exciting development. We're not just having a population explosion in the world, but here in America and in other Western countries, we're having an explosion of geniuses. And it makes for an interesting future, an acceleration of the times which are already stunning in the fields of science. Time magazine reported some time back that one of the delights of coeducation and rising college entrance standards is that the smartest 10% of young Americans are now thrown together on campuses at the most susceptible age for romance and marriage. The genetic consequence, reports physicist John R. Platt in the University of Chicago magazine Context, is a zooming output of high IQ children. These marriages are now producing 5 or 10 times the total number of youngsters with IQs of 150, for example, that we would get from perfectly random marriages in the normal population, where IQs average 100. He says that even more spectacular children may be coming out of the intellectual colonies like Oak Ridge or Los Alamos, where 1 man in 6 has a PhD, and out of the faculty communities of the great universities, where all the men and many of the women have advanced degrees. In the schools of such centers, says Platt, whole classes of 130s and 140 IQs may be seen from kindergarten through high school. Among the results can be found a 13-year-old studying atomic physics seriously, an 11-year-old doing graduate work in mathematics. In the general population, only 1 person in 300 reaches the 140 level. But if whole communities reach an average of 140, asks Platt, does 1 child in 300 reach an IQ of 180, and 1 in 2,000 reach 190? If this turns out to be so, we may not have to wait centuries for the next Newton. We may have a dozen within 20 years. The number of 180s getting out of college in the next few years may not be a mere dozen, but hundreds. It could be an explosion of genius, such as the world has never seen. It's an exciting idea, isn't it? You know, science and the arts don't move ahead steadily. They don't progress automatically, linearly. They move ahead in spurts, as here 1 person and there another makes a breakthrough. It's always a single individual, never the group, that makes an important discovery or improvement of an old principle. But they seem to come in batches. And with so many brilliant young people coming into the fields of science and industry and government, we can look for a definite surge in creativity in the solving of old problems. This will be reflected in every facet of our world, from furniture to automotive design and education, the arts, space technology, medicine and manufacture, distribution and sales of products, and the improvement of services. And this great new crop of geniuses will produce still more, of course. As physicist John Platt says, it could be an explosion of genius such as the world has never seen. A doctor was doing some generalizing one day, and he said, people have headaches generally because they don't avoid them. And a man named Kenneth Good says that people lose mostly because they won't take the trouble to win. It's all based on the answer one man got when he asked a friend of his, how many people work down where you're employed? And his friend answered, oh, about half. It seems that, except under the stress of a lot of emotion, fear of failure, heat of competition, or contest promoted to stimulate artificially these emotions, most people, including top business executives and men in the professions, rarely make any appreciable effort to improve their daily working methods beyond the minimum necessary to overcome each new emergency. This is according to Professor E. Lewis Swift of Washington University. The Chicago Sales Marketing Executives Club made an analysis some years back that proved that more than twice as many salesmen are fired for lack of effort than they are for illness, dishonesty, drinking, and gambling combined. And as for the rest of the people, an expert on scientific management, Mr. Frederick W. Taylor, proved that men and women are perfectly content to coast along on methods several times short of their best. According to Dr. William James, the wise old Harvard professor, called the father of American psychology, compared with what we ought to be, we're only half awake. Powers of various sorts we habitually fail to use. And Walter Dill Scott of Northwestern University said, many of us never know our possible achievements because we've never warmed up. It is more than probable that the average man could, with no injury to his health, increase his efficiency 50%, which all goes to prove that the human race is fixed, not to prevent the strong from winning, far from it, but fixed to prevent the rest from losing. It's a fact that to get ahead in the world these days, an average person needs neither the industry of Edison, or the ambition of Napoleon, or the cunning of Machiavelli, or the wiles of Lucretia Borgia. Just the opposite is true. Any man or woman going seriously to work, just seriously, mind you, will, as a rule, encounter unbelievably little opposition. He will, in fact, find his fellow citizens slowed way down for his benefit. Because most people work half-heartedly, using only a fraction of their potential powers, putting a man or woman with even a little ambition and a serious attitude toward his or her future into this group is like dropping a greyhound into a race of snails. And it's believed that the majority does not take a serious attitude toward the future, because the majority fails to decide upon one. Not knowing where they're going, they have no reason to hurry. It's easier to win than to lose, easier to succeed than to worry. The reason most choose the latter is because they can be done sitting down. We have more mental infirmities than all other illnesses combined. Dr. Charles H. Mayo once said that half the beds in our hospitals are filled by those people who worried themselves into them. You know, the mind is like an adding machine. Before you can solve a problem with it, it must be cleared of all previous problems. Worry jams up the mechanism. It short-circuits the whole operation, and the most valuable mechanism on earth just sits there and hums, feeding upon itself. It can't possibly solve your problems until it's been cleared, until worry has been cleared away. It's been proved many times that by a simple change in attitude, in mental outlook, that the same amount of time and energy devoted to worry could be used to solve our problems. Instead of worrying about the bills that have to be paid, shift gears and think creatively about ways of making more money. Instead of constantly stewing and worrying about a problem, we should try to think of ways of solving it. Creative people look at problems as challenges. They realize that without problems, everything would come to a stop. Problems are what keep the race moving forward. They're responsible for every forward step we've ever taken, collectively or individually. All industry exists solely for the solving of our problems, as does agriculture, education, and government. A person goes to school to learn to solve his problems and the problems of others. Where would the doctors be if there were no health problems, or dentists, or lawyers, or businessmen, or teachers, or workers? A woman wants to change the color scheme of her bedroom, and a painter gets a day's work. A paint company sells some paint, and so on. We've all got problems, and that's good. Without them, we'd still be swinging through the trees and living in caves, and all problems are temporary. As the wise man said, this too shall pass. So if you want to have a lot more fun and a lot less worry, try to put your problems in their true perspective. See yourself as a part of the world as a part of the universe, and the universe as a part of a great and mysterious living picture. Seen in their true light, most problems shrink to their true size. Then, don't worry about it. Shift your mental gears. Clear your mind of worry and set your mind to the solution of the problem. It has a solution. It will be solved. The same kind of problem has been solved a million times before. But as a wise old man said to me one time, in a life where death is inevitable, never worry about anything. If you come across a plank on the ground, say the plank is 12 feet long and 12 inches wide, you'd have no trouble walking from one end of it to the other. Now let's put that plank 100 feet high and stretch it between two buildings with nothing under it except 100 feet of air and a street down below. Would you walk it now? Same plank, same distance, but a different, more demanding situation. Let's say you're telling your family gathered around the dinner table about something in which you believe, your philosophy of living, for example. Now change the setting to an auditorium with 1,000 people in the audience, with you standing on stage before the podium. You're saying the same thing in the same way, but the setting's changed. Walking the plank and making the talk are easy for you in one set of circumstances. Without changing your performance at all, but only the setting, a new element is introduced which changes your mental attitude considerably. Fear of what might happen under this new set of circumstances turns two perfectly simple and natural performances into occasions of great risk, so great that you might refuse to do either of them. Not the fear of what will happen, but the fear of what might happen. Now, since you know perfectly well that you can walk the plank if it's on the ground, it stands to reason you can walk the same plank anyplace else. If you can make a talk under one set of circumstances, you can make the same talk under any other conditions. Anyone can see how true this is. But, and it's that but that seems to keep us from taking a formula we know will work under one condition and applying it to a larger situation. The fear of what might happen holds us back. We permit ourselves to fail by default, rather than run the risk of failing as a result of having made the effort to succeed. Now, it's not important that we walk the length of a plank, whether it's on the ground or high in the air, and it's not too important whether we make our little talk to the people in the auditorium, perhaps. But how many things are there at which we succeed, at which we could be successful on a much larger scale? It's all a mental game. We play the whole thing out in our minds, and it's there, not in actual practice, that we win or lose. No one can even guess how much is lost by the so-called average person simply because he fears to make the attempt. His fear of failure in his own eyes, in the eyes of his family and friends, and the possible loss of a small stake, raise a formidable wall between his reality and his dream. So he contents himself to peek at his dream over the top of the wall and wait. Wait until conditions are better, until Uncle Charlie dies and leaves all that money. But waiting just seems to make the wall grow higher. Conditions seem to remain about the same, and Uncle Charlie's going to outlive everybody in the family. And finally, even on tiptoes, you can't see over the wall anymore. It's too high now, and it's too late. Well, so what? It was just an idea, a dream. Yes, that's all it was, just an idea, a dream. But what could it have been? What might it have been if you'd scrambled over that wall before it got too high? Bertrand Russell wrote, "Our instinctive emotions are those that we have inherited from a much more dangerous world, and contain, therefore, a larger portion of fear than they should." Here are a few things I've collected over the years. There's a seagull on the Jersey coast who frequents a beach also frequented by couples who go there to park. This bird circles high overhead and drops clams on the tops of automobiles in order to break the shells. It never drops a clam on a convertible, just solid-top cars. Almost always, the car in which the clam has been dropped can be seen to immediately move away. A larger number of women than men attempt suicide, but men outnumber women by more than 3 to 1 in successful efforts. It seems the women don't really want to destroy themselves, but rather draw attention to their ills or grievances. Women are the beneficiaries of 80% of all life insurance in force in the country. They also receive 71% of the total estates left by men and 64% of the estates left by women. A woman has written that when a man looks a woman straight in the eyes, she'd better do something about her figure. And a woman is perturbed by what a man forgets. A man is perturbed by what a woman remembers. And did you know that a psychoanalytical study has come up with a discovery that the majority of women hate men? It is believed that this hatred is so deep-rooted and is of such long standing that most women aren't even aware of it. But the cause of the whole thing, the authorities agree, has its basic cause in woman's resentment of a male-dominated world. which in turn is founded on the mistaken notion that men are supposed to be endowed with qualities which make them superior to women. The facts prove that this line of thinking is just so much hot air, but for centuries, men forced this belief upon the women who were helpless physically to resist. It's the old story of might makes right. Men subjugated women because they were physically smaller and weaker, and in that day and age, physical strength rather than brains held the balance of power. Alfred Adler, the famous psychologist, points out that this crazy concept that men were supposed to be superior to women causes such extreme tension between the sexes as to seriously jeopardize any really happy relationship between a man and a woman. But if the woman realizes why she has these deep-rooted feelings toward men in general, she can usually overcome the situation and live happily with her man anyway. This is especially true if she's married to a man with some sense who realizes that differences between human beings do not indicate superiority or inferiority. They're simply differences. The wise woman realizes that it's ridiculous to blame her husband for the conduct of other men at other times in history. Her husband can be an honest man even if his grandfather was a horse thief. But the old deluded dogma of male superiority has been rammed down women's throat until she just naturally chokes up with rage. And, as they say, this has been going on since way before the beginning of civilization. I used to wonder why women in general show so little courtesy to men. This must be the reason. They don't like us, and they can't be blamed for it. As our civilization progresses, perhaps gradually we can get rid of women's ancient animosity toward anything wearing pants. We no longer think you're inferior, ladies, nor superior. Here's a question for you. If you had your life to live over, at least that part of it you've lived, would you do the same as you've done, or would you live it differently? Now, I don't mean the little things so much, but rather the big important things. It's a big question, and according to a survey, a third of the women would do differently if they could live their lives over again, and better than half the men would have chosen some other line to follow. Now, at first glance, it appears that women are a lot smarter than men in making the major decisions that affect their lives, but that's not the whole story. Men have a much wider choice as to careers than women. You can say that women have exactly the same choice, but it doesn't work out that way. You don't find many women piloting commercial aircraft or ships at sea or playing center for the Chicago Bears or second base for the Yankees. Most women consider their careers to be marriage, children, and the home, and it's a big enough career for anyone. Psychologists point out, for instance, that great numbers of young people every year give up their dreams for particular careers because love comes along. Now, in a way, this seems to be a victory for the woman in that she has achieved the career of her choice, while her husband has had to give up his. But the facts seem to point out that it's a Pyrrhic victory, and while the cost is deferred, it's nonetheless there and must one day be paid. Psychologists say that after the honeymoon's over and the young couple begin to stare life in the face, economics enters the picture. And this is one of the major reasons why more than half of the men surveyed indicated that they would have done differently if they could live their lives over again. They did not mean they would not have married their present wives necessarily, although I'm sure there were a sprinkling of these, but rather that they would have waited until they got on course before they married. Most of them in a few years wish they'd stuck to their original career decisions. They see then, although it seems they can't at the time of their mistake, that they could have had the career of which they'd planned and dreamed, and the woman to whom they're married. They could have had both, but they foolishly gave up one in favor of the other. They quit too soon. Economy is the great modifier of romance, and the girl is very wise who tells her young man to finish his preparation for his career before they marry. If their love is real and strong, it can stand the test of time. Time will only deepen it. If it's not the real thing, waiting will expose its flaws to the benefit of both of them. She will have a much better life, a contented husband, a better place in the community, and very probably more money to spend if she'll concentrate less on victory and more on a peaceful alliance. Occasionally, this picture is reversed, and then the man should be content to wait. A man needs a career outside of his home as well as a wife and children. Young women should remember this and get their starry-eyed young man back on the right track. I have an office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where I now do most of my writing. It's near a large, popular marina. And during the hour I take off for lunch, I enjoy walking about the marina in the sunshine and seeing what new boats have shown up. The other day, an interesting steel schooner of about 60 feet came in as I stood near the fuel dock. She had obviously been on a long voyage and was from out of the country, as her yellow quarantine pennant signified. I struck up a conversation with one of her 3 young crew members and learned they were British. They had sailed the schooner from England, first visiting Scandinavia and the North Sea, then down the coast of Europe to the Canary Islands, and from there to the West Indies, where they'd spent 3 months island hopping, scuba diving, fishing, and just enjoying themselves. One is a dentist, one an engineer, and the third, who owns the schooner, is a university graduate who is simply looking for adventure. They're all still in their 20s, in great shape from their months at sea, and delightful and interesting young men. My wife and I have had them over for cocktails and dinner and introduced them to a few people in the area. Everyone to whom we've talked about them agrees with us that these young men are doing something more young people should do. They're devoting a year or two to travel and adventure and to getting their heads on straight before entering their careers. Most young people go from school directly into their careers, from one institution right into another, with no breathing and thinking time in between. Now our young English friends are working and saving enough money to continue their cruise. They hope eventually to work their way around the world, and the dentist and engineer are thinking seriously of settling in the United States when their odyssey has ended. Here's an interesting fact, talking about cruising around the world. Of all the water on Earth, less than 1% of it can be used for human and animal consumption. Of this 1%, about 26% of it is found in the United States. 97.2% of all the water on Earth is salt water and found in the great oceans and seas. Now, this leaves only 2.8% that's drinkable, and most of this amount is in glacial ice, which we can't use, at Greenland and the South Pole. The Antarctic ice sheet, the heavy layer of ice covering the South Pole, represents some 90% of all existing ice in the world, and on the average is a mile thick. It's all fresh water, of course, since the great ice cap averages about 6,000 feet above sea level. At the South Pole, the ice is 9,200 feet above sea level. In at least one region, the ice is 14,000 feet thick and rests on land far below sea level. Most of the world's fresh water supply frozen stiff on the great continent of Antarctica and on Greenland, the world's largest island. Greenland is 50 times larger than the country that owns it, Denmark, about a fourth the size of the United States. 85% of it is covered in perpetual ice up to 10,000 feet thick. It isn't green at all. It was called Greenland as an advertising come-on for settlers, sort of like selling waterfront lots in Tierra del Fuego. Emerson wrote, "Nature magically suits the man to his fortunes, making these the fruit of his character." You have only to hold an apple in your hand to know that it came from an apple tree. It could not have come from any other kind of tree on earth. For we know the tree by its fruit, and you can tell a lot about a person by his fortunes, because, as Emerson said, they are the fruit of his character, and they are represented by his environment, what he has, what he is, what he does. But most people seem to believe not that their fortunes are only the reflection of what they are, but rather that they are the reflection of their fortunes. And thus they often domesticate themselves to live in an environment and under conditions which they do not like or enjoy because they feel there's no escape. My daughter used to ride in horse shows until she discovered boys are more interesting than horses, and while this is in many cases debatable, it often brought to mind an interesting parallel. Between horse show events, I used to hold and walk her horse for her. He was a magnificent thoroughbred hunter, alive with nervous energy and tremendous power. With one hand, I kept his nearly 1,000 pounds under control as he slobbered down my sleeve, just as my little girl did when she took him over the jumps. The thing was that he didn't know his power, nor that he could be free of either of us. He was controlled by our minds, certainly not by our strength, just as we control all the animals of the earth. And like the horse, millions, perhaps, are daily led through their paces by an environment of their own creation, never suspecting that they themselves have fashioned the halter and the lead by going along with it. That its strength lies solely in their thinking it controls them, and because they do not understand this, they are held as prisoners of themselves. Spinoza said, "To understand something is to be delivered of it." So then it is not their circumstances which control them. It is their lack of understanding that their fortunes are the fruit of their characters. Are you familiar with Buddha's Eightfold Path? Very little is known by most people in the Western world about this great man who lived 560 years before the birth of Christ. He taught for 45 years. Like so many great teachers, he wrote not a word, and more than 100 years followed his death before the first written records appeared. But let me see if I can give you his 8 steps for enlightenment, what we might call happiness. There are really 9 steps because one that he stressed that does not appear in the 8 is right association. To understand that good health is as contagious as disease, as are virtue and cheerfulness. So the preliminary step is to associate with those whom you want to be like. Then step number 1 is right knowledge. Anything here would be an oversimplification. Let's just say that right knowledge is an understanding that what is right is natural for us. To follow our natural inclinations and seek truth in everything we do or say. To understand that we can overcome our difficulties by following the right path and by having an ongoing program of continuing education. Step number 2 is right aspiration. To make up our minds as to what our hearts really want. To get on course toward it and stay on course. Step number 3 is right speech. To watch what we say in the understanding that it is an indication of what sort of person we are. To try to speak the truth in everything we say, and to say nothing that will not in some way help a situation or a person. To understand that our speech gives us away not just to others, but if we're wise, to ourselves. It reveals our true character, and like anything else, it can probably stand some improvement. Step number 4 is right behavior, and this includes the 5 precepts, the Buddhist variation on the second or ethical half of the 10 Commandments. Do not kill. Strict Buddhists are vegetarians. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not be unchaste. Do not drink intoxicants. Step number 5 is right livelihood. By this is meant to work at something which makes a positive contribution to society and is compatible with living the good life. Step number 6 is right effort. Buddha says, those who follow the way might well follow the example of an ox that marches through the deep mire carrying a heavy load. He is tired, but his steady gaze, looking forward, will never relax until he comes out of the mire, and it is only then he takes a respite. Step number 7 is right mindfulness. No teacher ever credited the mind with more influence over life than did Buddha. The best loved of his texts, the Dhammapada, opens with the words, all we are is the result of what we have thought. And step number 8 is right absorption. That is, meditation until you have seen the truth, have received enlightenment. In fact, the word Buddha means enlightened one. His actual name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born the son of a king and was, according to the legends, a strikingly handsome man who could have been a great king in his own right. But he chose to redeem his world rather than rule it. The power of his teachings are evidenced by the fact that millions still live by them. I read in Manus about a paper by E.F. Schumacher entitled Modern Pressures and Environment, in which it is recommended that we free our imagination from existing systems. I like that. We need to think in new directions. He writes, if still more education is to save us, it would have to be education of a somewhat different kind, an education that takes us into the depths of things and does not spend itself in an ever-extending battle with symptoms. The problem posed by environmental deterioration is not primarily a technical problem. If it were, it would not have arisen in its acutest form in the technologically most advanced societies. It does not stem from scientific or technical incompetence, or from insufficient scientific education, or from a lack of information, or from any shortage of trained manpower, or lack of money for research. It stems from the lifestyle of the modern world, which in turn arises from its most basic beliefs, its metaphysics, if you like, or its religion. The whole of human life, it may be said, is a dialogue between man and his environment, a sequence of questions and responses. We pose questions to the universe by what we do, and the universe, by its response, informs us of whether our actions fit into its laws or not. Small transgressions evoke limited or mild responses. Large transgressions evoke general, threatening, and possibly violent responses. The very universality of the environmental crisis indicates the universality of our transgressions. It is the philosophy, or metaphysics, of materialism which is being challenged. And the challenge comes not from a few saints and sages, but from the environment. Now, this is a new situation. At all times, in all societies, in all parts of the world, the saints and sages have warned against materialism and pleaded for a more realistic order of priorities. The languages have differed, the symbols have varied, but the essential message has always been the same. In modern terms, get your priorities right. In Christian terms, Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things, the material things which you also need, shall be added unto you. They shall be added, we've always been told, added here on earth where we need them, not simply in an afterlife beyond our imagination. Now, at issue here, Manus states, is whether or not nature, the universe, our environmental host, can speak in a language capable of being read in this way. Schumacher believes that it can. He says, today the same message reaches us from the universe itself. It speaks the language of pollution, exhaustion, breakdown, overpopulation, and also terrorism, genocide, drug addiction, and so forth. It is unlikely that the destructive forces which the materialist philosophy has unleashed can be brought under control simply by mobilizing more resources of wealth, education, and research to fight pollution, to preserve wildlife, to discover new sources of energy, and to arrive at more effective agreements on peaceful coexistence. I'm not real certain that he's correct about that, but he goes on to say that everything points to the fact that what is most needed today is a revision of the ends which all our efforts are meant to serve, and I'll certainly go along with that. And this implies that above all else, we need the development of a lifestyle which accords to material things their proper, legitimate place, which is secondary and not primary. The so-called logic of production is neither the logic of life nor that of society. It is a small and subservient part of both. Its destructive effects cannot be brought under control so that the destructive forces cease to be unleashed. The chance of mitigating the rate of resource depletion or of bringing harmony into the relationship between man and his environment is non-existent as long as there is no idea anywhere of a lifestyle which treats enough as good and more than enough as being of evil. And here lies the real challenge, and no amount of technical ingenuity can evade it. The environment, in its own language, is telling us that we are moving along the wrong path, and acceleration in the wrong direction will not put us right. When people call for moral choices in accordance with new values, this means nothing unless it means the overcoming of the materialistic lifestyle of the modern world and the reinstatement of some authentic moral teaching. And Mr. Schumacher turns now to the traditional 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, courage, and temperance, showing their application to the frenzied pattern of consumption which characterizes modern life. The fact is, as Manus points out, that habits of excess and waste have become reflexes in our daily life. Schumacher, in effect, is saying that we must learn thrift, conservation, reverence for the world, love for the earth, and another sort of respect for ourselves, not because supplies are running out all over, which they are, but because it is right to learn these things. And he's saying that we won't be able to do it without a philosophy that gives us reasons, for there are, after all, reasons which correspond to the instructions of the heart. The reasons arising from a sense of wholeness and synthesis are better than the reasons produced by analysis. In talking about the language of the environment, let me read something I wrote the other day in Mallorca, Spain. As I watched the sunset last night, I saw something that saddened and frightened me. The day had been perfectly clear, and at 7:15, as the sun sank toward a great rocky promontory, there was not a cloud in the sky, but the sky was an ugly, murky brown. The horizon was invisible. It was obscured by a thick, opaque layer of pollution, of man-made filth. There was not a seabird in the sky, nor had there been all day. The Mediterranean is a foul, nearly dead body of water, it appears. The only birds I've heard since landing in Spain, I wrote, were in cages at the Madrid airport, and it's the same in Naples, Genoa, Nice, Cannes, Barcelona. Man is in a dialogue with nature, and as Huxley once said, in comparing life to a game of chess, those who play the game well are paid with the overflowing generosity with which the strong delight in strength. But those who play ill are checkmated, without haste, but without remorse. Mankind is being checkmated, inexorably. His science and technology have not conquered nor tamed nature as he once thought. He has only been industriously digging his own grave. The planet can only respond to man through its reactions to his actions, and it is saying, I'm dying. You are killing me. And when man finally succeeds in killing his generous and long-suffering host, he will discover that he has succeeded in killing himself. He has proved to be a brilliant, but virulent species. And after he is gone, nature can begin again to clean his nest, and someday, probably surprisingly soon, the sunset over the Mediterranean will again be a thing of beauty. Incidentally, the pollution over the city of Madrid was as bad as any I have ever seen anywhere. It's as bad as it is in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Rome, and worse, I believe, than over most large American cities. Now, what can you and I do about the so-called materialist philosophy in the state of the world? I think we can start by re-evaluating our priorities and getting them in line with those of the rest of creation. My old friend Parky Parkinson of TWA used to make a speech he called The Tyranny of Junk, in which he urged us to clean house of all the junk we've collected, the basement, the attic, and every room in the house. Just get rid of it, recycle it. We can begin to discriminate as to what we're going to purchase with our money. Practice thrift on the one hand, and an avoidance of the continuing collection of junk on the other. We can develop and talk about a reverence for life, for the earth, and for each other. We can tell our kids, no, you can't buy that. Play with that mountain of toys you've already collected. Now, speaking out against materialism in our society is almost a kind of atheism. It's like being against mother and apple pie. And it isn't that we're against the technological industrial structure we've created. It's just that we want to relegate it to its proper place in the order of things. It shouldn't be in first place, not by a long shot. Now, in an earlier direct line, I quoted Mumford's suggestion that we make selective use of the best that our society has to offer. By all means. But we can be very selective. Yesterday I was shopping in the grocery store and picked up a tube of shampoo, since it was on my shopping list. When I saw the price stamped on it, I put it back and said to myself, I'll wash my hair with soap. There are so many things we can do without and still live well, even better. Now, we want our great business establishment to flourish and wax profitable. We would like to see it extend its sales and distribution and effects to the four corners of the earth. But let us make it qualify for our business the hard way, by producing a needed or much desired product of the very finest quality. Let's take home no more junk. Let's put ourselves and our kind and our earth and its creatures and beauty back into their proper places. I was reading of a proposal to put into orbit around the earth great reflectors to capture the sun's energy and send it to Earth by microwave. If the plan works, the Earth will have a free, non-polluting source of unlimited energy for at least the next 3 billion years, free at least at its source. It caused me to remember that there's always a way to what we need and want, if we don't stop with early ideas and decisions and get stuck on them. There's not only a way to what we want, but a way that is exactly right and does not demand too great a trade-off. Now, fossil fuels now supply 97% of all the Earth's energy needs. That's practically all of it. In less than 100 years, our dependency on this convenient and heretofore abundant fuel supply has become all but totaled. Now it's running out, perhaps in the nick of time to save the biosphere from lethal doses of hydrocarbon pollution, and we must turn to new energy sources. As we find them, we will wonder at our long dependency on fossil fuels. Now, it's the same with us when we follow the dictates of the voice that speaks to us at quiet times, the voice that is our true selves, trying to get through the artificial wall we work so hard to build around ourselves. When we have finally taken the steps we wanted for so long to take, we invariably say, why did I wait so long? What in the world was I afraid of? We tend to stop at partial solutions in almost everything we do. We get out of school, and as a rule, let our very partial and incomplete education suffice for the rest of our days. It's no wonder that so many millions are hanging on for dear life to the rudimentary and partial solutions they've managed to find for themselves. Eric Hoffer, in his book, The True Believer, has told us that there is a conservatism of the very poor that's as rigid as that of the very rich. They fear any change in the belief that no matter how bad their present situation may be, any change at all might be a change for the worse. We might say the middle class seeks change in that it tends to be upwardly mobile, but change to the middle class consists of a series of quickly grasped stopgap measures based mainly on the direction of the economy. When I read of Edward G. Robinson's death, I learned for the first time that his lifelong motto had been to reach beyond his present grasp. Now, I don't recall the exact words. I should have written them down at the time. It wasn't that he was advocating living beyond our means. It was more a matter of recognizing just what the true extent of our real means are and challenging ourselves to reach more closely toward them. And each of us has a voice bidding him to follow the way that is right for him. That voice is what the ancient Greeks called our soul, the real person lurking behind the facade we present to the world. I think that's why meditation is such a good and constructive practice. When we sit and quietly meditate, clear our minds of all cares, we let that quiet voice come through. Not at first, perhaps, but with a little practice it'll come. Very few people in the Western world meditate, and they often cut themselves off from their true selves by not following this ancient and enlightening practice. Perhaps it's in our childhood that we learn to settle for less than we could really achieve. How does that line go? Men are made into slaves not by heredity, but by the habits bred into them in their youth. We learn as youngsters that it's all right to settle for a passing grade. It's good enough becomes our slogan. And then we find ourselves applying it's good enough to more important things like a job, income, home, neighborhood. Do you like your work? Oh, it's good enough. It's okay. The Earth should not be relying for 97% of its power needs on fossil fuels, the happy accidental residue of prehistoric times. And we will see the move over the next 50 years to new, cleaner, more efficient, more effective, cheaper, and longer-lasting sources of energy. Deuterium from seawater, the harnessing of hydrogen and solar energy. The use of fossil fuel will become a fossil of history, a brief step up from the horse to the automobile and the jet airplane. But for a while, we thought we'd found the answer to man's power needs forever. During the lives of most of us, we'll see the thick, ugly pall of pollution removed forever from the skies and the return of clear sunlight, clean rain and snow, and fresh, breathable air. But how many of us have stopped too soon, too, in our own lives? Thank you. In his excellent book on becoming a person, Dr. Carl Rogers spelled out some of the characteristics of the new powerful person who is emerging in our culture today, and the vital different set of values he both maintains and lives. I stressed, he writes, his hatred of phoniness, this new person, his hatred of phoniness, his opposition to all rigidly structured institutions, his desire for intimacy, closeness, and community, his willingness to live by new and relatively moral and ethical standards, his searching quality, his openness to his own and others' feelings, his spontaneity, his activism, and his determination to translate his ideals into reality. I'm talking, he wrote, about a relatively small number of people, but I believe that these people constitute the change agents of the future. When some part of a culture is decayed at the core, a small group with new views, new convictions, and a willingness to live in new ways is a ferment that can't be stopped. Let's take a look at that new person emerging in our culture and see if you and I qualify. I'd like to think that the total subscription list of Direct Line is made up of these powerful new emerging people. First, his hatred of phoniness. Our new powerful person sees through facades and tinsel, outmoded and ridiculous customs and beliefs. Free of the tyranny of things and the opinions of others, he and his family, she and her family, live in a kind of solid serenity where true values count, where the verities, things like truth and justice, the family and work, take on real meaning. It is in the avoidance of phoniness that real freedom may be found, and one can drop off the rat race with a great sigh of relief. There are no inner circles to which these people need apply for membership. They are the centers of their own circles. This person is opposed to all rigidly structured, closed institutions. Such institutions are saying, by the fact that they're rigidly structured and closed, we have the answers. We need look no further. This is it. The new powerful person knows that at this early stage of our development, such thinking is infantile. We do not have all the answers about anything. And just as the maturing person is in a stage of growth, of becoming, so is a vital institution. It uses what it has and what it knows as springboards into the future, and assiduously avoids becoming closed and rigidly structured. A good and viable institution, like a self-actualizing person, is always in a state of growth, of becoming. He has a desire for intimacy, closeness, and community, and a willingness to live by new and relative moral and ethical standards. This person has a searching quality and an openness to his own and others' feelings. He's spontaneous, unafraid of what others will say of his enthusiasms and ideas, and is determined to translate his ideas and ideals into reality. Now, of course, these people must constitute a relatively small number of people, a true inner circle, the most important and influential club of human beings on Earth. The qualifications for membership are tough. To meet them takes work, thought, and study, a willingness to find oneself and be oneself, but the perquisites of membership are great indeed. One of them is freedom. Another is joy. One of the world's greatest cartoonists, to my mind, is Fernando Cran. Many years ago, I cut one of his cartoons out of the Reporter, which depicted the entrance and exit to a subway. Coming out of the exit is a crowd of adults. Going down into the entrance is a crowd of children. All the children are laughing and smiling and enjoying themselves. But on the faces of the adults coming out of the subway are expressions of anger, boredom, worry, and not one smile or joyful expression in the lot. There's no caption. None is needed. The cartoon very graphically asks the question, what happened to all of those smiles and happy expressions between the ages of childhood and adulthood? Well, what did happen to them? Are we to say that adult life is so full of sorrow and pain and problems that it cannot be experienced in a consistently happy way? No, in fact, a little later I'm going to give you some statistical data pertaining to happiness, who's happy and why. But this group of powerful people, emerging people in our society, while more aware of the world's problems than 95% of their fellows, still enjoy their lives and do not belong to that sad group coming out of Fernando Cran's subway. I've stood at the exits of subways and watched the people coming up. Nobody expects them to be doubled over with helpless laughter or skipping and playing like children, but their expressions seem to indicate that life for them is an extremely serious and as yet unfathomed riddle, and they give the impression that they're not growing as persons, and are perhaps, in fact, drawing back, shrinking into their little molds and hardening like concrete. Incidentally, my all-time favorite Fernando Cran cartoon portrays a man on the end of a pier who is obviously bent on suicide. He has a rope tied around his neck with the other end tied around a great stone. In attempting to throw the stone over the end of the pier, all he has accomplished is to drop it on his foot. The cartoon shows him hopping on one foot, holding the injured foot in his hands. The caption of the cartoon is simply, incompetence. And if we ever needed proof that the only way to growth and maturity and knowledge lies in the lonely and arduous hours spent alone in thought and study, this thought from the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer should convince us. Truth that has merely been learned is like an artificial limb, a false tooth, a waxen nose. It adheres to us only because it is put on. But truth acquired by thought of our own is like a natural limb. It alone really belongs to us. And if you wonder from time to time why so many of the adults you see and know about you shackle themselves with the outmoded ideas of the past, Schopenhauer also wrote, there is no absurdity so palpable but that it may be firmly planted in the human head if only you begin to inculcate it before the age of 5 by constantly repeating it with an air of great solemnity. When a child asks his parents what he should be when he grows up, they often, and with the very best of intentions, try to steer him toward a particular calling or profession. I remember my parents wanted me to be a lawyer. When children seek advice, here's a pretty good answer. Look for the truth. Look for the truth in everything. Spend your entire life looking for truth, and you will have spent it as nobly as any human being who ever lived. And the calling that's right for you will come along. Archibald MacLeish wrote, what is freedom? Freedom is the right to choose, the right to create for oneself the alternatives of choice. Without the possibility of choice and the exercise of choice, a man is not a man, but a member, an instrument, a thing. Dr. Carl Rogers says that responsible personal choice is the most essential element in being a person and is the core experience in psychotherapy. Francis Bacon said, if a person will begin with certainties, he will end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he will end in certainties. Isn't it true that we try to raise our children to begin with certainties in which we ourselves have no deep and abiding faith? And isn't it also true that most people reach adulthood in frustration and doubt and fear because those childhood certainties have crumbled and fallen apart? Could this be why the people coming out of Fernando Cran's subway appear to be marching to a death camp? Now let me read something to you and see what you think of it. 40,000 years ago, in the bleak uplands of southwestern Asia, a man, a Neanderthal man, once labeled by the Darwinian proponents of struggle as a ferocious ancestral beast, a man whose face might cause you some slight uneasiness as he sat down beside you, A man of this sort existed with a fearful body handicap in that Ice Age world. He had lost an arm, but still he lived and was cared for. Somebody, some group of human things in a hard, violent, and stony world loved this maimed creature enough to cherish him. And looking so across the centuries and the millennia toward the animal men of the past, one can see a faint light, like a patch of sunlight, moving over the dark shadows on a forest floor. It shifts and widens, it winks out, it comes again, but it persists. It is the human spirit, the human soul, however transient, however faulty men may claim it to be. In its coming, man had no part. It merely came, that curious light, and man, the animal, sought to be something that no animal had been before. Cruel he might be, vengeful he might be, but there had entered into his nature a curious, wistful gentleness and courage. It seemed to have little to do with survival, for such men died over and over. They did not value life compared to what they saw in themselves, that strange inner light, which has come from no man knows where, and which was not made by us. It has followed us all the way from the age of ice, from the dark borders of the ancient forest into which our footprints vanish. It is in this that Kierkegaard glimpsed the eternal, the way of the heart, the way of love which is not of today, but is of the whole journey, and may lead us at last to the end. Through this, he thought, the future may be conquered. Certainly it is true. For man may grow until he towers to the skies, but without this light, he's nothing, and his place is nothing. Even as we try to deny the light, we know that it has made us, and what we are without it remains meaningless. We have come a long road up from the darkness, and it well may be, so brief even so is the human story, that viewed in the light of history we are still uncouth barbarians. We are potential love animals, wrenching and floundering in our larval envelopes, trying to fling off the bestial past. That's good, isn't it? It's from the book that belongs in your library and mine, The Firmament of Time, by Loren Eiseley, published by Atheneum. Dr. Eiseley taught anthropology at the University of Kansas and Oberlin College before he was named chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he later became provost. This is the kind of book that helps us grow, that helps us move closer to the truth about ourselves. And here's something we should read or listen to once a day for the next 45 years. It was written back at the turn of the century by William George Jordan. He was editor of several magazines during his lifetime, including the Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote, "Calmness is the rarest quality in human life. It is the poise of a great nature, in harmony with itself and its ideals. It is the moral atmosphere of a life self-reliant and self-controlled. Calmness is singleness of purpose, absolute confidence, and conscious power ready to be focused in an instant to meet any crisis. The Sphinx is not a true type of calmness. Petrifaction is not calmness, it's death, the silencing of all the energies. While no one lives his life more fully, more intensely, and more consciously than the person who is calm. The fatalist is not calm. He's the coward slave of his environment, hopelessly surrendering to his present condition, recklessly indifferent to his future. He accepts his life as a rudderless ship drifting on the ocean of time. He has no compass, no chart, no known port to which he's sailing. His self-confessed inferiority to all nature is shown in his existence of constant surrender. It is not calmness. The person who is calm has his course in life clearly marked on his chart. His hand is ever on the helm. Storm, fog, night, tempest, danger, hidden reefs, he's prepared and ready for them. He's made calm and serene by the realization that in these crises of his voyage he needs a clear mind and a cool head. That he has nothing to do but do each day the best he can by the light he has. That he will never flinch nor falter for a moment. That though he may have to tack and leave his course for a time, he'll never drift. He'll get back into the true channel. He'll keep ever headed toward his harbor. When he will reach it, how he will reach it, matters not to him. He rests in calmness, knowing he's done his best. When the worries and cares of the day fret you and begin to wear upon you and you chafe under their friction, be calm. Stop. Rest for a moment, and let calmness and peace assert themselves. If you let these irritating outside influences get the better of you, you're confessing your inferiority to them by permitting them to dominate you. when the tongue of malice and slander, the persecution of inferiority, tempt you to retaliate, when for an instant you forget yourself so far as to hunger for revenge, be calm. When the gray heron is pursued by its enemy, the eagle, it does not run to escape. It remains calm, takes a dignified stand, and waits quietly, facing the enemy unmoved. With the terrific force with which the eagle makes its attack, the boasted king of birds is often impaled and run through on the quiet, lance-like bill of the heron. No person in the world ever attempted to wrong another without being injured in return, some way, somehow, sometime. Remain calm. Now, although that was written at the turn of the century and in language that today might sound a bit affected and archaic, it's a good message. If ever there were a quality needed in the crisis-filled world of today, it's calmness, and the kind of clear thinking calmness produces. Another attribute of that new emerging person we were talking about. I wonder how improved our days would be if we would make it a point to go over that little message every morning. Here's a quotation I like. It's by William Drummond. He who will not reason is a bigot. He who cannot is a fool. And he who dares not is a slave. The distinguished psychologist, the late Dr. Maslow, said something that should be kept in mind by every parent and businessman and executive, teacher, by every person in any sort of position of authority. He said everyone seems to be aware at some level of consciousness of the fact that authoritarian management outrages the dignity of the worker. He then fights back in order to restore his dignity and self-esteem. He will do this actively with hostility and vandalism and the like, or passively as a slave does with all sorts of underhanded, sly, and secretly vicious countermeasures. These reactions are puzzling generally to the dominator, but on the whole they're easily enough understood, and they make very real psychological sense if they're understood as attempts to maintain one's dignity under conditions of domination or of disrespect. In the foreword to his book, If Men Were Angels, Milton Mayer writes of when he was a youngster. His mother would say, "Wear your rubbers." "Oh, gosh, Ma, don't gosh me, wear your rubbers." "Why do I have to wear my rubbers?" "Because I say so, that's why." Or to his big brother, "I want you to take care of your little brother this afternoon." "Gosh, Ma, why do I have to take care of him?" "Because I say so, that's why." Now, because I say so has never been a very good reason for doing anything, not as a child and not as a grown-up. Whenever we're faced with arbitrary authority, we burn and rankle. Whether it's a worker, a secretary, a wife, husband, or child, his self-esteem is his most valued possession. If you hurt it, he'll find a way of getting back, of restoring his self-esteem in his own eyes. If not, he will be diminished in his own eyes. The juvenile delinquent, the adult delinquent are examples of this kind of thing. Human beings avoid being manipulated, dominated, pushed around, determined by others, misunderstood. People don't like and will not stand for being a nothing rather than a something, unappreciated, not respected, not feared, not taken seriously, laughed at. People will not tolerate, even though they may appear to be doing so, being ludicrous figures. They don't like being treated as a physical object rather than as a person. As a rule, they don't like to take orders, be forced, used, exploited, controlled. They don't want to feel that they're helpless, compliant, deferent, an interchangeable person. What human beings are seeking is to be prime movers, self-determination, to have control over their own destinies, to determine their own movements, to expect success, to be active rather than passive, to be a person rather than a thing, to have others acknowledge their capabilities fairly. To succeed as a manager of others, in getting along with people generally and our families, we must avoid anything that tends to diminish another person's self-esteem, because people must then find a way to build it back up, and will generally do it in a negative fashion. They will strike back at us directly or indirectly. People will willingly follow the direction of another who directs them in such a fashion as to bolster, or at least keep intact, their feelings of self-esteem. And one of the ways to keep good employees is to keep the level of noise to the absolute minimum. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "The amount of noise anyone can bear undisturbed stands in inverse proportion to his mental capacity, and may therefore be regarded as a pretty fair measure of it." Noise is a torture to all intellectual people. A good indication of the truth of that can be observed by watching children grow up. In their first few grades, they shout at each other constantly at the very top of their lungs. Anyone who has had to take a small child to a children's matinee can attest to that, or listen to them on the school playground. As they move up in the grades, though, the noise level drops, and even in a class of very young people, it's generally thought to be true that the quietest children are the more intelligent. And finally, young people in their teens are far quieter than children of 7 or 8, except when it comes to their music. The more intelligent a person becomes, the more his voice will diminish in volume. The quiet, controlled voice is infinitely more effective when dealing with others, small children included. Shouting or loud talking is almost always a sign of inferiority, real or imagined. It hurts the ears and grates on the nerves and causes real fatigue. People who tend to raise their voices when they get angry should try to do just the opposite. They'd be far more effective and would tend to retain better control of themselves. A person's intelligence can be said to be in inverse proportion to the amount of noise he can tolerate. A couple of my acquaintance with 3 small children bought a second-hand limousine with a glass divider between the front and back seats. On long trips, they simply roll it up and drive along in blissful peace and quiet, while the kids play, scream, and fight in the back seat. I visited an interesting company in Dallas, Texas some time back, whose offices, even though they required several floors of a large office building, had only about 3 traditional offices as such. They were offices, I believe, for the president, the chairman of the board, and the conference room. All the other people occupied spaces surrounded by movable modules. Telephone and electrical cables came down from the ceiling. Now, the entire floors were deeply carpeted with good acoustical material on the ceilings. There was a marvelous silence about the place. After a trial period, the people were polled as to their opinion of the new setup, and they were virtually unanimous in their acceptance of it. It's very difficult to imagine an intelligent, thoughtful, poised person making a lot of noise, shouting or losing control. A person should speak just loudly enough to be heard clearly under all circumstances. A distinguished American psychotherapist has said that no one, as far as we know, is born neurotic. We learn to become neurotic as a result of our upbringing. We are raised by other human beings, and they literally teach us to become neurotic. If a child is raised to believe that intelligence and beauty are worthwhile traits, and that he is bright and handsome, well, he will tend to look upon himself as good and to have a favorable self-concept. But if he's raised to believe that he is stupid and ugly, he will tend to look upon himself as bad and to have a poor self-concept. Our early self-concepts depend upon the concepts that others have toward us. If those who are important in the life of a child generally blame him, he will learn to blame himself. If they consistently accept him, he will learn to accept himself. That does not mean that the self-concept the child first learns is absolutely final and crucial. He can, later in life, change it for better or worse, but it's hard. And this early self-concept is most important, and it does tend to set the pattern for later attitudes and behavior. I read somewhere that self-confidence is like a psychological credit card, and I can still remember my mother telling me that I could do anything I set my heart upon. To tell a youngster he or she is great is to give him the kind of self-image he needs to build a meaningful life for himself. Youngsters will discover their limitations, their blind spots, the areas in which they have little or no aptitude soon enough without our help. Self-confidence is a kind of psychological credit card and is of far greater value than any other we can carry. When we see someone who is neurotic, it should elicit our sympathy in the realization that the person was not born that way. He was taught to be neurotic by his elders. Neuroses are like chains that are put on children to hinder them in their development and activities. If you'd like to examine yourself for traces of neurosis, Dr. Albert Ellis, in his book How to Live with a Neurotic, gives us a list of popular beliefs, irrational ideas, really, each of which indicates a neurosis. You can check your own against the list. Remember, each of the following statements is false and indicates a neurosis. An adult must be approved of or loved by almost everyone for almost everything he does. What others think of him is most important. Depending on others is better than depending upon oneself. A person should be thoroughly competent, adequate, talented, and intelligent in all possible respects. The main goal and purpose of life is achievement, success. Incompetence in anything whatsoever is an indication that a person is inadequate or valueless. One should blame oneself severely for all mistakes and wrongdoings. Punishing oneself for errors will help prevent future mistakes. A person should blame others for their mistaken or bad behavior. He should get upset by the errors and stupidities of others. One should spend considerable time and energy trying to reform others. One can best help others by roundly criticizing them and sharply pointing out the error of their ways. Because a certain thing once strongly affected one's life, it should indefinitely affect it. Because a person was once weak and helpless, he must always remain so. Because parents or society taught the acceptance of certain traditions, one must go on unthinkingly accepting these traditions. If things are not the way one would like them to be, it is a catastrophe. Things should be better than they are. Other people should make things easier for us, help with life's difficulties. No one should have to put off present pleasures for future gains. Avoiding life's difficulties and self-responsibilities is easier than facing them. Inertia and inaction are necessary and or pleasant. One should rebel against doing things, however necessary, if doing them is unpleasant. Much happiness is externally caused or created by outside persons and events. A person has virtually no control over his emotions and cannot help feeling bad on many occasions. If something is or may be dangerous or injurious, one should be seriously concerned about it. Worrying about a possible danger will help ward it off or decrease its effect. Well, how did you do? That was a list of beliefs indicating neurosis. Getting back to our saying that self-confidence is a kind of psychological credit card, I don't think enough has been said about the power of positive expectation. It's truly amazing, and there's simply no explaining it. When we confidently expect something worthwhile to materialize in our lives, it invariably does. It works like pure, unadulterated magic. It gives each of us a kind of magic wand with which we can bring all sorts of interesting and rewarding events and things into our lives. Those who have cultivated this power, who consciously and actively work at it, regularly do the most amazing things. As with neurosis, we're often taught as youngsters to expect the worst. We have so often heard people say, well, with my luck, the whole deal will fall through, indicating that their luck is usually bad. How many times have we heard someone say, if you don't expect to succeed, you won't be disappointed? And learn to be content with what you get. On giveaway television programs, we watch young people playing it safe. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I read a financial column in the Miami Herald the other day in which a young man of just 20 wrote of his losses in a mutual fund and commented that he'd been unable to sleep and he'd lost weight over it. The columnist commented that he should never risk his money. He should put it in the bank or the savings and loan where he knows it's safe. I think it's safe to say that the majority of people have a suspicious and negative outlook toward those life situations which, to an intelligent minority, represent virtually unlimited opportunities. Now, this is not to say that positive and expectant people do not occasionally lose money in their investments or have problems. I'm sure they do. It's just that it doesn't bother them the way it seems to bother most people. And over the long haul, well, they're miles ahead of the pack. They face their days with an attitude that expects the best, and that's what they're going to get as long as they can maintain it. What others worry and stew about, they confidently expect a successful outcome, and most of the time they get it. If you have trouble maintaining this powerful force for good in your life, a reminder card, placed where you'll see it every morning when you get up and at odd times during the day, can help you get on course and form a very valuable new habit. My small son, while doing his homework the other evening, whimsically said he wished he had his own private computer to help him. I reminded him that he has between his ears a tool far superior to any computer ever devised. The brain of man has four remarkable powers that far exceed anything yet built into a machine. One, it has the power to absorb, to take in information and knowledge of every kind. We do this by reading, listening, touching, by using all five of our senses. Our minds are like unlimited corrals with the gates wide open. Two, we have the power of retention, the capacity to retain knowledge and recall it. Like a million filing cabinets, the human mind, which can capture, store, recall, and program more than 600 bits of information per second, keeps all of it readily available for recall and use, with unlimited space for additional information. Three, we have the power of judgment, of logical thought. The more facts we feed our brain, the more able it is to reason and judge intelligently. And four, the greatest power of all, the power of imagination. The ability to think creatively, to create something that's never before existed on Earth, like a computer, to take old ideas and combine them into new relationships, to dream, to think of things that do not now exist, to project ourselves into the future with the automatic time machine of our minds. That's the power that's made man what he is. Our great humming modern computers are nothing more than the abacus was to the ancient Chinese, a better way to do our arithmetic and store information. We'll devise new and far more remarkable machines in the years to come, but we'll never create one as great as the human mind. If a greater agency is to appear on Earth, it will have to come from the stars. As Francis Bacon put it, seek ye first the good things of the mind, and the rest will either be supplied, or its loss will not be felt. Poking through my old files, I came across something I liked very much. It appeared some years back in McCall's magazine, written by Elliot Joseph, and entitled Secret Thoughts of a Happy Husband. A working wife is a gift from heaven. Sleeping late is not harmful. A shopping woman is an unhappy woman. This is a generalization based on the psychologically sound discovery that unhappy wives get rid of their frustrations by excessive shopping. Keep them happy and you'll save some money. It takes only one to make a good marriage. Fresh orange juice is the elixir of love. People who travel are easier to live with at home, and women are night people. It is humanly possible to have a good marriage. A woman with taste is always beautiful. Call your wife anything but mother. I know a man who calls his wife mommy, and every time I hear him do it, I find myself wanting to throw up. Thank your wife after every meal. Large twin beds are twice as good as any double bed. Nothing is more tangible to a woman than love. Never talk about your wife. Fat women are more fun. I don't know how that got in there. Man will remain uncivilized as long as he has to share a bathroom. You know, I've long thought that one of the prime reasons for earning an above-average income is so that a man and his wife can each have his own bathroom. Women don't understand soft-boiled eggs. A gentleman never refuses a lady. Women are usually right, but for the wrong reasons. Living for today builds memories for tomorrow. Women who wear men's pajamas make good companions. One woman is enough for a real man. Nothing can rival home life. Being yourself is always best, no matter how painful. Women have to be awakened with extreme care. And finally, living with a woman is a little like working backstage. Some secret thoughts of a happy husband. A long-time bachelor who finally married was asked some months later what kind of a match he'd made, and he said, well, I really didn't do as well as I expected, and to tell you the truth, I don't think she did either. Some years back, the head of a large, successful business enterprise was faced with the most important decision of his career. At a special meeting of his company's executive committee, there were displayed the products of his largest competitors. His advisors told him that because of recent discoveries, it was now possible to produce the product they manufactured at a tremendously accelerated rate. Not only could their product now be manufactured in far less time, but it would affect enormous savings and thus result in substantially lower prices to the trade and the consumer. This would result, the committee pointed out to him, in mass buying of the product. But more important than that, they said, it was the only way they could remain competitive since their big competitors had now adopted these new discoveries. Well, the president examined the products of his competitors very carefully. There was no doubt about it. It was an ingenious new way to lower production costs. Then he asked the committee, will this new method make the product better, cause it to give better service, and last longer? Well, the committee had to answer that it would not. That this new method, while adding greatly to manufacturing efficiencies, could not hope to match the quality of their present method of manufacturing. Then we shall continue to build our product as we have in the past. All the arguments about how the buying public would quickly shift to the competitors' new lower prices for the same product failed to move him. We will not sacrifice quality, he said. In the end, the customers will come back to us. Well, the entire executive committee was aghast at his decision. Privately, they called him an old fool, and for a couple of years, exactly what they predicted came to pass. The customers flocked to their competition. The competition sales skyrocketed because of the new manufacturing breakthrough, while my friend's company's sales steadily declined. All this while, my friend's company continued to make the best product in the industry and to advertise this fact, and that it would not compromise with quality. Since the new method of manufacture did result in an inferior product, one that would not stand up to hard use in time, the buying public began to become disenchanted. People began to realize that what had seemed to be a big saving in money was actually resulting in greater costs because of needed service. Moreover, the product just didn't perform nearly as well as did that produced by my friend's company. Well, all over the country, the reputation of my friend's company and product climbed steadily, while the reputations of his big competitors just as steadily dropped in the minds of the buying public, and just as important, in the minds of the dealers and their salesmen. Soon the tide turned completely. Today, because of that decision to stick to uncompromising quality in the face of what appeared at the time to be sheer disaster, my friend's company is the largest of its kind in the world. The company's name and the products it manufactures are first in the minds of the buying public, and there's an important lesson here for each of us. I have a book by Barry Stevens titled, Don't Push the River. What she means by that is, let the river flow. Don't try to hurry it. Time will bring the best to the top. Now, change is important, but not change for the sake of change necessarily. If we can make it better, let's change it. If we can make it more attractive, more convenient, perhaps smaller or lighter or more functional, let's do it. But let's do it gradually and make sure we know what we're doing. Let's take the time to test our new changes until we know we won't be faced with a drop in our reputation and perhaps the recalling of thousands of products with the resulting loss in time, money, and customer loyalty. Do you remember when Robert N. Manry, a copy editor at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, sailed from the United States to England in a 13.5-foot sailboat? 3,200 miles across the North Atlantic in a boat so small you'd hesitate to take it out on Lake Michigan or Long Island Sound as small craft warnings were flying. For 78 days, Manry and his tiny 36-year-old sailboat battled one of the toughest stretches of salt water on Earth. Gales blew the boat on its side. Manry tried to nap during the day and sailed at night so that he could try to avoid being run down and chopped into kindling and hamburger by great ocean-going steamers. On several occasions, he was washed over the side in heavy seas, and each time he'd haul himself back aboard by a lifeline he kept tied about himself and to his boat. He suffered terrible hallucinations, the result of having to take so many pep pills to stay awake during the long nights. Why? What made him do it? It wasn't publicity. He went about the whole thing so quietly, practically no one even knew what he was up to. He thought no one would pay any attention to him, and that was fine with him. The reason was that he had dreamed of sailing the Atlantic ever since he had been a small boy. He bought the dinky old boat for $250. He completely rebuilt it, taught himself navigation, and practiced long-distance sailing on Lake Erie. He told his wife the real reason for his embarking on so incredible a journey and so vulnerable a craft. He said to her, there's a time when one must decide either to risk everything to fulfill one's dreams or sit for the rest of one's life in the backyard. That's why Mr. Manry went sailing over the mountains of deep water in a boat only about twice the size of your bathtub. That's why he sat in his tiny open cockpit and weathered storms that caused the passengers to clear the weather decks of great ocean liners. He was fulfilling a dream he'd carried in his heart since he'd been a small boy. Well, offers for books and magazine articles poured in on him. Cleveland gave him a hero's welcome, as did the 20,000 people who wildly cheered the successful end of his voyage when he arrived in Falmouth, England. It's been proposed to Congress that Manry's boat, Tinkerbell, be placed in the Smithsonian Institution alongside Charles Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Courage. The courage to finally take one's life in one's own hands and go after the big dream has a way of making dreams come true. It seems to open hidden doorways from which good things begin to point the way. It's never easy, and the good results come only after we've made the journey in our own way. For Manry, at 47 years of age, it was sailing 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic. Each of us must make his own voyage to fulfillment in his own way. Or sit in the backyard. Now here's an opportunity to test your mental health. A study made by Drs. Charles Solly and Kenneth Mumdum at the Menninger Foundation came up with a prescription for good mental health. It consists of 5 parts. As I give them to you, ask yourself how you stand with regard to each. Mentally healthy people behave consistently in 5 important ways. 1, they have a wide variety of sources of gratification. This does not mean that they chase frenetically from one activity to another, but that they find pleasure in many different ways and from many things. If for any reason they lose some of their sources of gratification, they have others to turn to. For example, a person who loses a good friend by death may sorrow, but if he has other good friends, he draws psychological sustenance from them and recovers. But if a man loses his only good friend, well, he has little else to fall back on and continues to grieve in his loneliness. A person has the same problem if his only interest is his job or his immediate family or a single hobby. 2, mentally healthy people are flexible under stress. This means simply that they can roll with the punches. When faced with problems, they can see alternative solutions. Flexibility under stress is closely related to having a wide variety of sources of gratification. With more supports to fall back on, a person is less threatened by situations that produce fear and anxiety. 3, they recognize and accept their limitations and their assets. Put another way, they have a reasonably accurate picture of themselves, and they like what they see. That does not mean that they're complacent about themselves, but that they know they cannot be anyone else, and that it's all right with them. 4, they treat other people as individuals. Now, this is a subtle phenomenon and an important one. People who are preoccupied with themselves pay only superficial attention to others. They're so tied up in themselves that they can't observe the subtleties in another person's feelings, nor can they really listen. Mentally healthy people really care about what other people feel. And 5, mentally healthy people are active and productive. Mentally healthy people use their resources in their own behalf and in behalf of others. They do what they do because they like to do it and enjoy using their skills. They do not feel driven to produce to prove themselves. They're in charge of their activities. Their activities are not in charge of them. When they're chosen for leadership of one sort or another, it's because they have the skills to lead in a given situation, not because they have to exercise power over others. They seek achievement for what they can do, not for what they can be. For when one tries to be something or someone, he's never satisfied with himself, even if he achieves the desired goal. Well, there you are, a 5-part prescription for good mental health. How'd you do? How does one obtain this condition called mental health? Well, mental health is had in the working toward, as Dr. Rogers says, in the process of becoming, of pursuit. Life is short. It's to be lived. And he who has good mental health lives it to the fullest. And he who lives it enjoyably has good mental health. A few years ago, a team headed by Dr. Gerald Gurn of the University of Michigan interviewed thousands of men and women on the source of their joys and sorrows. When the results were in, they were a surprise to everyone concerned, but they have since been confirmed by sufficient studies to validate them. Here they are. 1, married men are the happiest people in our society. Next, and I think you might be in for a surprise here, comes single women. Followed in the number 3 position by wives. Bachelors bring up the rear. They're the losers in the happiness sweepstakes. 2, people who worry are happier than those who don't. Now, this is another surprising but well-documented discovery. Very old people who have given up don't worry. Neither do the hopelessly poor and the downtrodden. People who are actively involved with life do. They worry constructively about their marriages, children, finances, careers, in the firm and happy belief that they can change things for the better. 3, money does bring happiness. I don't think anyone ever seriously doubted this, do you? Certainly being unable to pay the rent and meet medical bills or finance a child's education are unhappy states of affairs. People with high incomes report being happy just as often as those with modest but adequate incomes and means do. 4, the more education a person has, the happier he tends to be. Now, that certainly explodes popular opinion. In fact, the more you study, the more you realize that popular opinion is practically always pure baloney. 5, where a person lives makes little difference one way or the other as far as being happy is concerned. Apparently there's nothing to those stories of blissful rural life versus the sheer hell of city living or the claims of rival regions. 6, men tend to get more enjoyment out of children than women do. This is because men are handed the pleasures of parenthood without most of the pains. This does not mean that women would be happier without children. 7, women who work outside the home seem to be no happier and no less happy than housewives. 8, the husband's occupation does affect the happiness of the marriage. The wives of clerical workers, salesmen, and professional men are highest in reporting happy marriages. Those of unskilled workers and farmers, the lowest. And how are you coming with your home library? Do you need some good ammunition on why it's important to read? The last time I checked the statistics, I think they indicated that only about 4% of the adults in this country have bought a book within the past year. That's dangerous. It's extremely important that we keep ourselves in the top 5 or 6%. In one of the monthly letters from the Royal Bank of Canada, and those letters are marvelous, it was pointed out that reading good books is not something to be indulged in as a luxury. It's a necessity for anyone who intends to give his life and work a touch of quality. The most real wealth is not what we put into our piggy banks, but what we develop in our heads. Books instruct us without anger, threats, and harsh discipline. They do not sneer at our ignorance or grumble at our mistakes. They ask only that we spend some time in the company of greatness so that we may absorb some of its attributes. You do not read a book for the book's sake, but for your own. You may read because in your high-pressure life, studded with problems and emergencies, you need periods of relief, and yet recognize that peace of mind does not mean numbness of mind. You may read because you never had an opportunity to go to college, and books give you a chance to get something you missed. You may read because your job is routine, and books give you a feeling of depth in life. You may read because you did go to college. You may read because you see social, economic, and philosophical problems which need solution, and you believe that the best thinking of all past ages may be useful in your age too. You may read because you're tired of the shallowness of contemporary life, bored by the current conversational commonplaces, and wearied of shop talk and gossip about people. Whatever your dominant personal reason, you will find that reading gives knowledge, creative power, satisfaction, and relaxation. It cultivates your mind by calling its faculties into exercise. Books are a source of pleasure, the purest and most lasting. They enhance your sensation of the interestingness of life. Reading them is not a violent pleasure like the gross enjoyment of an uncultivated mind, but a subtle delight. Reading dispels prejudices which hem our minds within narrow spaces. One of the things that will surprise you as you read good books from all over the world and from all times of man is that human nature is much the same today as it's been ever since writing began to tell us about it. Some people act as if it were demeaning to their manhood to wish to be well-read, but you can no more be a healthy person mentally without reading substantial books than you can be a vigorous person physically without eating solid food. Books should be chosen not for their freedom from evil, but for their possession of good. Dr. Johnson said, "Whilst you stand deliberating which book your son shall read first, another boy has read both." Emerson wrote, "Do that which is assigned you, and you cannot hope too much or dare too much." He wasn't talking about what we're assigned to do by people. He was talking about our natural assignment, that which has been built into our bones and fibers, the unseen set of our very being. 1,000 people may work for a living at the same trade, but each of them has abilities and talents uniquely his own. There are things he can do with ease because of his natural set that the other 999 people cannot do as well or with the same facility. 1,000 young women may marry and set about the business of having children and keeping houses, yet each of them is different from the other 999 in some respects. Each of them has had something assigned to her, and as Emerson said, in this area of her life, she cannot hope too much or dare too much. It's the same with every one of us, and it's through the development and fulfillment of this inborn facility that each of us can achieve a degree of greatness during his life. If we never find our strong characteristic, it's because not knowing we had it, we fail to look for it. In the Sermon on the Mount, we're told, "Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you." Finding our strong point is a good place to put this advice to work. Only in this way can we take the advice of Thoreau and suck the marrow from life, shave life close, and live fully extended. Many people find their real talent, but because of the advice of well-meaning friends and relatives or because of their own mistaken idea about security, remain at jobs they don't like and for which they have no real aptitude. Thus they often shackle themselves to a slow shuffle when, had they followed their real stars, they could have known so much more in the way of inner satisfaction and reward. Do that which is assigned you, and you cannot hope too much or dare too much. Games are won by people who make the fewest mistakes. A good friend of mine is a good ping-pong player, but he can't beat his son at the game. He's got all the fancy shots, but his boy just returns every one of them. He just gets the ball back across the net and waits for his father to make a mistake. I think the great Chris Everett plays tennis in much the same way. Who shoots the lowest score in golf? It's the person who makes the fewest mistakes. A golf course is so arranged and the ball and clubs are so constituted that the player is penalized for any mistake he makes, no matter how slight. In order to make it around the course in par figures, parring every hole, you must not make a single mistake. And it's the same with any game you can think of, including the game of life. As the philosophers tell us, it's all a matter of cause and effect. If the cause is right, the effect will be right. But if the cause is wrong, nothing on God's green earth can make the effect come out right ever, except, very occasionally, by pure chance. Once in a while, a golfer will make a bad shot, as I did the other day. I'd pulled my drive to the left, and it was headed for water when it struck a tree, a very small tree, too, and bounded back into the fairway. We saw Lee Trevino win the British Open by chipping his ball into the cup from off the green. But over a period of time, these average out with bad bounces and bad breaks. And it's the same with this business of living. We're going to have lucky breaks from time to time, especially if we're headed in the right direction. And they're great when they come along. But over the long haul, our success or failure will depend on the number of mistakes we make or don't make. For every mistake we must pay. If it's a small mistake, maybe the cost is small, but it gets us off the track. It slows us down just as a slice or hook means coming back from the rough or a lost ball. For every big mistake, the cost is big, and the biggest mistake of all is to try to live in such a way that we avoid all risks. If we played golf with nothing but a putter, we would probably never get in a rough, a sand trap, or off the fairway, but we wouldn't score well either. So it comes down to Dr. Rogers' comment that responsible personal choice is the most essential element in being a person. Sometimes this means using a 3-wood or an iron off the tee, but usually it means using the driver. For the good player plays with risk, but concentrates on making few mistakes. It is said that a great man is always willing to be little. He has gained facts, learns his ignorance, is cured of the insanity of conceit, and in this way he plays the game well. He makes few mistakes. He wins. A long time ago, I clipped an item from the Saturday Evening Post written by an Englishman named Nigel Balchin. He wrote, "The child is the sacred calf of the modern world, and the high priests of the child cult are always bidding us bow down and worship the sacred calf, and reminding us of all the happiness it brings to us, how beautiful and fascinating it is, and how unworthy we are of the privilege of being parents. Any man who criticizes children automatically labels himself a monster. Well, I have 5 children," he writes, "varying in age from 30 to 3. So I've been rearing sacred calves for 30 years, and will almost certainly be doing so until I die. As a result of this not inconsiderable experience, I find that the whole business is, on the whole, an expensive and unrewarding bore, in which far more has to be invested, both materially and spiritually, than ever comes out in dividends. My father worked his head off to raise me and my brother and sister. I've worked mine off in order to bring up my children. I don't doubt that in 20 years' time my young son will be working his head off to bring up his. This process can go on indefinitely, and it simply means that no generation can ever live its own life to the full because of the insistent demands of the next. More talent and creative ability have been lost to the world through the necessity to provide for children than from any other single cause. In the whole history of civilization, 90% of man's progress has been brought about by people who realized that there were more important things to do than just reproduce their species. Some of them have had children, but they never have allowed the existence of these children to deflect them from the proper use and exploitation of their own talents." He goes on to write, "Whether we like it or not, children are fundamentally antisocial. They are cruel, ruthless, cunning, and almost incredibly self-centered, and they can conceal these qualities beneath a veil of careful charm. Let us then," he goes on to write, "stop the woolly, sentimental worship of children as living dolls and get on with the serious business of educating and maturing them as potential adults. In order to do this, we have to get rid of the idea that the family group, father, mother, and children, has some peculiar, almost mystical value. I know of no evidence that this is true, and of plenty that the family group is a source of emotional disturbance. The family group with child-worshipping parents is about the worst way in the world to bring a child to grips with the facts of adult life." The title of Mr. Balchin's article was "Children Are a Waste of Time." I remember reading that Evelyn Waugh, the author, said, "No matter how busy I may be or important the work I may be doing, I manage to spend at least 5 minutes a day with my children." And it's been said that the main reason adults want their children to grow up, marry, and have children of their own is because it's the only way they have, Pyrrhic victory though it is, of getting even with them. But when you're coming home and see your child running to meet you with its little arms outstretched and a glow of pure happiness on its face, or crawl into your lap and put its arms around your neck, it's worth it, even if it's only for the moment. Besides, let's face it, children are here to stay. My old friend Dr. Harold Blake Walker of Evanston sent me something some time back that I enjoyed tremendously, and I think you will too. He wrote, "We live by faith, or we do not live at all. Either we venture, or we vegetate. If we venture, we do so by faith, simply because we cannot know the end of anything at its beginning. We risk marriage on faith, or we stay single. We prepare for a profession by faith, or we give up before we start. By faith, we move mountains or opposition, or we're stopped by molehills. Faith, however, is not often tranquil and steady. It ebbs and flows like the tides of the restless sea. Normally, like Browning's bishop, we are forever exchanging a life of doubt, diversified by faith, for one of faith, diversified by doubt. Yesterday we began the day with confident hope, with trust in its promise. Last night, perhaps after a trying and troublesome day, we were beset by doubt and anxiety. We grope and fumble in search of certainty, wishing we could escape the doubts that haunt us. The peril is that we shall cease groping on through our doubts and live only on our negations. What we need, you and I, is faith strong enough to bear the burden of our doubts. No man ever drilled an oil well without being troubled by misgivings as the drill chewed downward toward producing structures, but only a fool would cease drilling halfway to the hoped-for pool. It was William Morris, the painter, who wrote, "I tell you, it's no joke to paint a portrait. Into the painting of every picture that's worth anything there comes a period of doubt and despair. The artist, however, goes on with his work beyond his doubt to creative achievement. Faith enough to carry our doubts. It's enough. Perhaps it's all we can manage when fears assail and doubts annoy. Maybe we can do no more than grope on through our uncertainties, pursuing the enterprises of our lives in the grim trust that the end will justify the struggle. If, despite our gnawing doubts, we can muster faith enough to take a single step on the road to where we're going, we are on the way to creative achievement. Every triumph of the human spirit begins with one step taken in faith. The single step is the small handle to great matters. No man or woman ever won a worthy triumph without faith to keep on, always able to last at least 5 minutes longer. There's one further thing to be said, namely that worthy triumphs cannot be won without faith enough to maintain our integrity. One of the ultimate tests of faith is our capacity to go on believing that somehow the right is the right, even when right is on the scaffold and wrong seems to be on the throne. All of the great ventures of our lives require faith enough to bear the burden of our doubts, so that we're able to take the first step in the direction in which we wish to go. Enough of faith to keep on going through struggle and strain, and to maintain integrity on the way. I like that. Yes, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, and we need to exchange a life of doubt, diversified by faith, to a life of faith, diversified by doubt. Thank you.